Good evening, denizens of the planet Earth. Today we're doing another video review. It's been a while since I've done one of these, but there has been the usual accumulation of apologetics on YouTube that needs responding to, and particularly since Nathan's sort of AWOL at the moment, I guess it falls to me to pick up my cross and review some more resurrection videos, which is what we're going to do today. So this video here is one that I saw a few days ago being released and thought, well, being about the resurrection of Jesus and all that, which is a topic that's been of interest to me for many years, I should probably give this a look. And I did, and I think it's terrible. So we're going to review it, or at least the first part of it. I don't know if we'll go through all the questions. Now, a little bit of background, as usual, the caveats. So this is basically an advertisement for Jeremiah's, or Dr. Jeremiah Johnston's book here. I like it how Sean McDowell is also a doctor, but don't put a doctor before his name. I always have a principle that if you have a doctor before someone's name in a context like this, you shouldn't trust them. Of course, it's not really up to them, but nevertheless, I just find it a bit cringe. Anyway, but I find, this video is basically an advertisement for Dr. Jeremiah Johnston's book. And so it's fairly brief, the comments that he gives. He presents his reasons in the rubric of 7 arguments for, or new evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So I feel like the response to much of what I will say is likely going to be, oh, you should read the book. And I guess my response to that is, well, first of all, I'm responding to the video, not the book. Second of all, I don't know why I would read the book when the summary given here in, 30 or 40 minutes is so bad and the arguments are so facile. And most of them are just the same things we've heard for decades anyway, with a slightly different spin on some of them. Why would I waste my time reading yet another book on the resurrection when I have no reason for thinking that there's going to be anything of value there? But of course, I could be wrong, and I could be persuaded to read this book and review it if I thought that there was value in doing so. But nevertheless, so I'm going to provide a critical eye on, or critical insight on what's mentioned here. I will focus on what he says as well as arguments that I'm familiar with. I appreciate he may go into more detail in the book, but nevertheless, this is a review of the video, not the book. So if he says it in the book but not here, that's just too bad. I think that is enough in the way of preamble. So let's make a start.
Dissertation on the resurrection. So you studied this. You sent me a 90,000 word monograph, and you've kind of popularized that for this book, so to speak. How did you come up with these 7? Was it like 7 is a biblical number, so I just need 7? Why these 7 arguments?
The 7 were the most compelling, and it really came out of taking the content that I researched when we lived in Oxford in 2009 to 2012, and just getting it down. You do this internationally, Sean. Just what is something the audience can remember that still challenges the skeptics, challenges the seekers, encourages those who are already Christian thinkers. But my audience is the vast majority of followers of Jesus who love Jesus. But if you ask them, hey, tell me, why do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus evidentially, and don't use your Bible, they're going to give you a deer in the headlights look. And so just spinning out of several. I mean, I've taken 12 years.
Welcome, Adrenochrome Slurper. That's an interesting name. Yeah, so I should probably give a spoiler at this point. So unfortunately, there isn't any new evidence. Everything that he says here is familiar. Some of it may be presented in a slightly different way, arguably. But I at least didn't find anything that was novel here. And I don't really understand how there can still be people putting together novel books or monographs or whatever about the resurrection and the powerful evidence for it. The evidence base is so small and it's been so thoroughly picked over for centuries. There's already so many books about this. Like, just think of Craig, Lacona, Habermas, N.T. Wright, just off the top of my head of some scholars I'm familiar with. And there's so many others as well, lesser figures, and the people who've been on YouTube, like these YouTube channels before. There's so many people who've written the same damn book about these evidences for the resurrection. Why do we need yet another one? It's like apologetics is this sort of self-sustaining, well, a bit like academia, I suppose. It's this self-sustaining organism that just needs ever more books about the same thing and a slightly different spin on the same very meager body of evidence. Anyway, so I don't really know why this book's even needed, but whatever, let's keep going.
Years since I finished the research.
Wow.
To refine it in other publications as well, and also to allow scholars to give feedback at places like Society of Biblical Literature and other places where I've presented aspects of what's gone into this book. So 7 just worked out, and there's actually 2 more in the book. So maybe I should have renamed the subtitle 9 Reasons.
Well, fair enough. It's too late now once the cover's done. But
right.
One thing you say the best 7 reasons to believe and why it matters. Now, typically, I would talk about why the resurrection matters after we've laid out why we think it's true. But this is my last question before we get to your 7. Tell me why the resurrection itself matters.
The resurrection event, as a factual event that occurred in space and time, matters because without it,
Is there such thing as a non-factual event? I guess maybe he means like a fictional event or a theoretical event.
In other words, if we were to say a resurrection-less Christianity is no Christianity at all. The entire belief system of the Christian movement hinges on the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ to such an extent that Christianity, unlike any other religion or ism in the world, has put itself to the historical test that if Jesus did not physically rise from the dead in space and time, then we're really to be pitied. We really are believing in nothing. And there's no difference between Christianity and fairy tales and myths. That's why it's important.
Well, that's a pretty good case. The truth of Christianity rests upon the resurrection.
See, I think that answer there exemplifies the problem with apologetics. That answer shows just how insular apologetics is. Think about that answer. That answer is saying the resurrection matters because if the resurrection didn't happen as a factual event in history, then Christianity is, false and a waste of time. Now, think about that from the perspective of someone who's not a Christian. That's just like saying a belief of Christianity is important because if that belief weren't true, then Christianity won't be true. I mean, okay, well, who cares? Like, what's that to me? I mean, Christianity, if I'm not a Christian, is just one of many belief systems, religions in the world. So what if it's not true? I'll do something else with my life. You see, that's only weighty or substantial if you're already a Christian, or at least that's already important. It's something that's important to you. It's just the unbelievable inability to see things from another perspective, like to answer the question in a way that appeals to someone who's not already invested in whether the resurrection happened. Like, it's so strange. The question is, why does the resurrection matter? And the answer is purely to define it in terms of some other belief system that presumably the person already has. Otherwise, like, why would they care about this? Like, why not explain why the resurrection matters from the point of humanity? Like, I mean, it's not like Christianity doesn't have an answer to this, but I just think it's so strange that apologists often answer questions like this in a way that actually doesn't answer the question unless you're already a Christian. It's like not appealing to anyone who's not already part of the group. But of course, we know that that's what apologetics is for. It's just to protect people's beliefs or remove doubts.
So let's jump into year 7. And by the way, those of you watching, we're going to come back and we're going to take some questions at the end. So be thinking through your questions. And if you'll write question in caps and make your question succinct. Society is transformed everywhere Christianity is introduced.
Hang on.
All right, Jay, let's jump in. You say reason number 1, society is transformed everywhere Christianity is introduced and embraced. So what do you mean by this? And why is that a reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead?
The resurrection event overwhelmed the followers of Jesus to such an extent that it became the core of their teaching and the very center of their practice and faith and life. So much so that the Dominical tradition of Jesus was actually, which is the teaching of Jesus, which was actually usurped by the event itself. The early Christian movement experienced the resurrection of Jesus, and it revolutionized their worldview to such an extent that everywhere the gospel goes, suddenly we see the gospel clashing with the worldviews of the time. And the cut and thrust of the Roman Empire, I've written a whole book on it, was hell on earth. And so
I don't know what he means by the Roman Empire was the cut and thrust of the Roman Empire was hell on earth. I don't know. I guess he wrote a whole book on it, so it must be true. But I feel like I'm living in a fantasy land sometimes. How is this supposed to be an argument for the truth of anything? The argument is that when Christianity is introduced, I mean, first he's talking about the Roman Empire, but I mean, he mentioned across the world. So I'm imagining he's talking about as it spread in subsequent centuries. It clashed with existing beliefs and traditions and changed societies. So is the principle here that if a belief system changes societies and causes upheaval and clashes with existing beliefs and, causes ruptures in families and societies and whatever, then it's more likely to be true? Is that the principle that we're appealing to here? Because if so, well, we've got like Buddhism, we've got Islam, you've got Confucianism, you've got Taoism, you've got communism, like Marxism, you've got like scientific materialism, humanism, all the isms, right? Like this is true for all of these belief systems, political, religious, social movements like environmentalism, feminism, all of these, this is true for all of these movements. So why is that evidence for Christianity being true? Again, it's like, this only makes sense as an argument if you see everything through a Christian lens. It's like, the only thing I ever think about is Christianity and its impact on the world. I don't think about anything else's impact on the world or how this compares to other faith or non-faith ideologies or traditions. Because as soon as you think in that way, you realize, well, actually, yeah, this point that he's making is true for literally any bigism or tradition or ideology or movement, and therefore it doesn't distinguish Christianity. It's true that Christianity is the world's largest religion. I don't know if mere popularity is the basis for truth. Also, it hasn't been the world's largest religion for most of history, so I'm not sure if that's relevant. But anyway, he didn't make that point. So what exactly is supposed to distinguish Christianity? Because nothing that he's just said has distinguished it from other religions and traditions. And by the way, nor has he established what the basis for inferring truth from being influential is. Like, why think something is true because it's influential? What does that have to do with anything? What's the argument there that there's a connection?
We can trace out of the upper room the teaching that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave, married with the experience of the early Christians who actually saw him, touched him, had dined with him in his resurrection state. This caused them, it motivated them to spread the message because it is true. It has a life-transforming value, and that value extends to all people. Everything from the treatment of women and children to the very bedrock of what we might call Christian civilization or Western civilization. And so,
hang on. So I'm going to jump back there because, it's like every freaking buzzword or hackneyed argument is in this video, which is, or at least relating to the resurrection and like Christian history, which like triggers me so much. There's just so much nonsense here. Anyway, so let's do this one
clashing with the worldviews of the time. And the cut and thrust of the Roman Empire, I've written a whole book on it, was hell on earth. And so we can trace out of the upper room the teaching that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the grave, married with the experience of the early Christians who actually saw him, touched him, had dined with him in his resurrection state. This caused them, it motivated them to spread the message because it is true. It has a life-transforming value.
Okay, so what he said there is that the experiences that the disciples had with the risen Jesus motivated them to spread the message. All right, I can agree with that. I mean, that's what I think, right? I think that's what most people think, at least more or less. But then he says it motivated them because it was true. Let's unpack that again.
The early Christians who actually saw him, touched him, had dined with him in his resurrection state. This caused them.
I mean, again, we get the presupposition here of the point that he's trying to prove. He's trying to establish that the resurrection is historical, and he's already sort of asserting, well, that they really did dine with him. Well, then, if that was established as a fact that you can just appeal to in the conversation, then why even bother? He should say that they claimed to have, or they believed that they dined with him and so forth. But let's just assume that he said that. But anyway, so they had these experiences, and then
motivated them to spread the message because
motivated
it is true.
them
it has
to
a
spread the message
transformation
because it is true, right? It has a life-changing message. Or I think he said "pal." Let me make sure I get that right.
This caused them, it motivated them to spread the message because it is true. It has a life-transforming value, and that.
Okay, so it has a life-transforming value. So again, there's a principle that's being appealed to here, which seems to be that things only have a life-transforming value if they are true, or at least that they're much more likely to have a life-transforming value if they are true. What is the basis of this principle? How have we established that ideologies, movements, social groups like this are more likely to be motivating and life-transforming if they are true? Where does that come from? Again, do I have to go through all of the isms, most of which he would not agree with, or at least find many things to disagree with, and then find all the people who've been motivated to change their lives and beliefs on the basis of these other isms, and to show that this seems to be at least very questionable? And he doesn't even discuss this, as if this is not something that he needs to establish. The whole logic of his argument is that something is more likely to be motivating to change one's life significantly if it's true, but he doesn't even. Not only does he not attempt to show this, he doesn't even acknowledge that that's a key point in his argument, that's the linchpin of what he's saying here. So this is just so much hot air. He's just saying, oh, Christianity is just so great, and it's so great because it's true, and therefore people will change their lives because of it, without seemingly have stopped to think, well, but can people change their lives for things that aren't true but may still be motivating? Like, it's just, like, this is such a basic point. How is it that I have to say this?
Value extends to all people. Everything from the treatment of women and children to the very bedrock of what we might call Christian civilization or Western civilization. And so we lay out 10 ways in which, in the book, had Christianity been a resurrection-less religion, it would have died. And here's 10 ways that the society is radically different because Jesus, in fact, did rise from the dead.
Yeah, so it doesn't really go into details here about 10 ways that Christianity has changed society. Again, I'd like to know what that. So we've had two claims. One is that isms or ideologies or whatever are more likely to be motivating for people to substantially change their lives if they're true. And another one is that they are more likely to have a substantial change in societies if they're true. We haven't got any evidence or reasons or any reflections at all on why we should think this. But we've just sort of asserted. In fact, he hasn't even asserted that. He's implicitly said that. I've had to sort of pick that out of what he said to make sense of it. Otherwise, it is. I mean, yeah, those assumptions are at the basis of his argument here. But then he sort of appeals to, I think, in defense of that, some changes that have occurred in society over the millennia as a result of Christianization. Certainly, there were changes as a result of Christianization. Some good, some bad. That's a longer video to discuss all of those, and he doesn't go into detail here. So I just want to say that this notion of Christian civilization is really problematic. Western civilization, if we want to trace that back to the ancient Greeks, which I think is reasonable, there is a continuity there from the Greeks to the Romans, and then, in the medieval period, sort of picked up more in the West through the Renaissance, but also surviving in the Byzantine tradition and so forth. There is a continuity there that I think you can draw. But the problem with that is that it predates Christianity by something like 1,000 years. Or if you go right up to the Christianization of the Roman Empire in like the 4th century, almost 1,500 years. So actually, if we say that Western civilization is a bit over 3,000 years old, let's say dating back to the composition of the Homeric epics, Christianity has only been dominant religion in the West for like half of that. Okay, a bit more than half of that. And then to just sort of call it Christian civilization is really dubious. But then the other point is that how does Dr. Jeremiah Johnston know what would have happened in society if it hadn't been Christianized? I mean, there are some reasonable inferences one might draw about very specific things that Christians promoted or argued in favor of. But on the whole, we don't really know, right? I mean, many apologists claim to know that the scientific revolution, say, wouldn't have happened were it not for Christianity, which I think is utter nonsense. But that's, I think, one that's mentioned later. And then they try and credit like improvements in women's rights and abolition of slavery and all of these sorts of other things like democracy and whatever to Christianity. Basically, every good thing that's happened in the Western world in the past 2 millennia is credited to Christianity or Christian beliefs. Not just Christianity, by the way, specifically Christian beliefs, because of course, that there's a distinction between institutionalized religion and religious practice on the one hand, and then theology on the other hand. And it could be the case that an institutionalized religion could have benefits or bring benefits to society, kind of irrespective of what its theological teachings is. So you'd probably want to say, for example, that the many hospitals and orphanages and things that were set up in the Islamic world, particularly during the time of the Islamic Golden Age, from like the 7th to the 13th centuries or whatever, you'd want to attribute those as a Christian apologist. You'd want to attribute those to, well, at least you wouldn't want to attribute those specifically to any uniquely Islamic belief, right? Because you would want to say, well, I presume at least you would want to say that the things motivating them to do that or that lead them to do that are outside of the specific theological claims that you disagree with. So the issue is, how do you disentangle, like, even if you say that Christianity is in some sense the cause of these good things, how do you disentangle whether that's Christian theology or the institution or cultural and sort of other aspects of Christianity? But of course, somehow the ledger only has things added to one side. We only ever see Christianity being accredited the good things that have happened in the Western world in the past 2 millennia. Somehow all the negative things, such as continued oppression of women, continued practicing of slavery, including exacerbation of the slave trade in the early modern period, including colonialism, including the Crusades to the Holy Land, the Reconquista in Spain, the Crusades in the Baltic regions and Eastern Europe, the religious wars, the Inquisition and persecution of heretics and religious dissidents throughout history, including the witch trials, culminating in the 17th century. On and on and on. All of these things somehow are not caused by Christianity. They're something else, or they're there because humans are wicked or something like that. But then everything that's good that happens, well, of course, that's caused by Christianity. That's traceable directly to belief in the resurrection. Why think this? This is just nonsense. This is special pleading. This is just bias writ large. Like, this shouldn't be taken seriously, is my point. So, yeah, and even there's so many levels why this is wrong. It's not clear that Christianity is the cause of any of these things in a sort of direct, like, causal relation way that he wants to describe it. Even if it was, it's not clear that it's attributable to theological belief in the resurrection specifically, as opposed to other aspects of Christianity. Even if it was attributable to theological beliefs, then you have to weigh all of the negative aspects against it. And then even aside from all of those factors, there's still the question of, but does that mean it's true? Like, even if it does cause all of these good things, does that, and no bad things, hypothetically, would that make it more likely to be true? And it's sort of unclear why that's the case. It could just be a useful fiction or something that is socially beneficial, but is in fact false, right? So I don't really understand how this argument is supposed to work at like any of those levels. It's so full of holes. It's sort of unbelievable.
Okay, now, so you point out certain things like the hospital movement and care for human rights, the development of science. I could easily see somebody push back and say, okay, you're right. It's the Christian ideas of this that foster this movement. If you believe people are made in the image of God, if you believe that Jesus has conquered the grave, this could foster the development of these kind of movements. But why is that a reason to believe Jesus actually rose from the grave? Isn't that a reason to believe that the story of Jesus appeals to the human heart, motivated people to live differently? Tie that to the actual resurrection for me.
Yeah, so Sean actually does give some good objections here. He sort of, throughout the video, he sort of presents them as kind of softballs, though, or partially answers them himself. And also don't think that Jeremiah does a very good job at answering them. So anyway, Sean has said in his brief remarks some of the things that I have said. Let's see how Jeremiah responds.
Yeah, you asked hardballs right at the beginning. That's why I love coming on your show, Sean. Thank you for asking questions.
Yeah, that's not a hardball. That's like the lowest ball obvious thing that you could ask. But anyways.
That skeptics and seekers alike are like, oh, thank you. We finally get to the good stuff at the beginning of the show. First off, I would take a...
By the way, I can't help commenting, and this is not unique to Jeremiah here. The phrase seekers and skeptics, I think that sometimes the phrase is also used believers and skeptics. I just find it fascinating how the language is used of skepticism here, that skepticism is contrasted with seeking and also contrast with belief. I suppose there's a philosophical sense in which you might contrast skepticism with belief, but in this sense, believer is more meaning like, well, Christians, right? So the point is that if you're a skeptic, you're not seeking. And I think for that they mean seeking, I don't know, Jesus, seeking truth, seeking something, which is, well, where does that come from? Like, can't you be a skeptic and a seeker? That's kind of how I don't call myself a seeker, but I think I, in some sense, would identify with seeking knowledge, seeking wisdom, seeking understanding. And just the way that's contrasted as if you're a skeptic, you're not if you're a skeptic, you're not a seeker. And then if you're seeking, you shouldn't be like a skeptic. I think that's silly. But also the notion that if you're a believer, like in Jesus or a Christian, then like skepticism is bad or you shouldn't be a skeptic, which I think is ridiculous. Skepticism is good and everyone should be skeptical and consider themselves a skeptic, at least in that loose sense. Anyway, I just think, I'm not saying that Sean or Jeremiah would necessarily disagree with that. I'm talking about the way that skeptic is used in a sort of offhanded way, as in a kind of a derogatory and us and them fashion in apologetics discourse. And it's so interesting if you pay attention to that, in a way that casts skepticism as like a problem, sort of pathologizes it, it others it, and it presents it as a negative. I mean, this is just a small example, obviously, but it's something that I have been more aware of recently.
A lot more faith to believe in that scenario because the Christian movement had died. In Luke 24:21, the disciples on the way to Emmaus said, we had hoped he was the resurrection, but he's not. Jesus Christ was thought to be a failure like many of the other messianic pretenders and contenders of the first century. The movement had died out, and why shouldn't it? Their savior had, quote unquote, died on a Roman cross as an enemy of the state. But this one fact alone is what separates the Christian movement from all others, and that individuals.
Okay, right. So so Sean's question was, why does the fact that Christianity has been influential or that many people have changed their lives, why does that mean that it's true? That was the crux of the question. Jeremiah first has just sort of said people really believed it. I mean, okay, that doesn't answer the question. And now it feels like he's getting to the crux of the question, which is, okay, what's the difference? What distinguishes Christianity from other faith and non-faith traditions? Okay, let's hear what the answer is. Skip back a second there.
But this one fact alone is what separates the Christian movement from all others.
What's different about Christianity?
Individuals. And they didn't feel like it. They didn't want to experience. This was not some kind of wish-filled thinking. They had left. They had departed. They had apostatized, if you would. And then, boom, this one historical truth transformed them from running scared to being willing to risk their life, and in doing so, come up against the big worldviews of the Roman Empire, which, again, was hell on earth. So,
yeah, so I think that's the second time I've listened to this now. I think you'd be forgiven if you sort of missed what the thing was, because he started saying individuals and then he sort of went on a tangent. Let's listen to it again and see if we can work out what the distinguishing feature is between Christianity and other traditions or other teachings that also have an influence in the world.
It was not some kind of wish-filled thinking, and that individuals, and they didn't feel like it. They didn't want to experience. This was not some kind of wish-filled thinking. They had left. They had departed. They had apostatized, if you would. And then, boom, this one historical truth transformed them from running scared to being willing to risk their life, and in doing so, come up against the big worldviews of the Roman Empire, which, again, was hell on earth. So,
okay, so I think, he puts in so many, like the empire being hell on earth, or they didn't want to, they were running scared. They just say a sentence and make the point clear. I just hate the way this guy talks. It just drives me to distraction. But so what he seems to be saying there is that the reason why we can be confident that Christianity, or specifically the resurrection, happened is because it changed the disciples' lives and they were super convinced in it. So remember, Sean's objection, and I fleshed it out a bit more, but the crux of that objection is, but can't people change their lives and be influenced by something and then it change society, even if it's false? Couldn't it just be something that resonates with people? And Jeremiah's answer appears to be, well, no, because the disciples were really convinced and it changed their lives. Now, I think that you can kind of build a little bit more on that, because he does mention, oh, they were running scared. They were, and I think he's talking about the fact that in the Gospels it says that after the crucifixion of Jesus, the disciples were, I don't know that they're entirely consistent, but it sort of says that they left, or that they were they were scared, they didn't know what was going to happen, and they were confused and all that sort of stuff, right? So he seems to be saying that because at that particular point in time, the disciples were confused that they'd lost their faith, or that they were kind of leaving or whatever, because at one specific point in time, the disciples had this mental state, that therefore the only reason, or at least the overwhelmingly most plausible reason, how they could have changed their mental state and become motivated to spread Christianity was if the resurrection happened. That is, there's no way that any other factors could reasonably have led them to transform between being kind of frightened and running off to being like zealous missionaries. That's effectively the claim. He's saying that they were in this state, and then later they were in this state, and the other way to join the dots between them is a resurrection. He actually says that more explicitly later, but that appears to be the argument here. I don't know why I always have to do so much of the work for apologists, maybe not always, but a lot of the time, because they're so unclear about what the argument actually is. But notice the problem here. The objection is, can't people be changed by things that aren't true? That's the core of the objection. And the response is, no, the disciples would only have been changed by something if it were true, and specifically like this kind of experience. But we haven't been given any reason to think that. We know that lots of people's lives are changed by things that aren't true. At least if you're a religious exclusivist, that has to be true, because of all these other religious movements where people's lives were changed and they went out teaching and they were persecuted and so forth. Not to mention like people who give up their lives for a religion, or who kill other people, or go to drastic feats of asceticism and denying food and things like that. All sorts of things that people do in the name of religious traditions, but also political and other movements too. In order to account for this, and many of these, you can't say that they're all true, because they're contradictory, and many of them I know someone like Jeremiah wouldn't endorse, right? So it seems that we have a lot of reason to think that there are other mechanisms, psychological, sociological, whatever it is precisely. There are other mechanisms to join those dots between frightened and kind of running away to, bold disciples or preachers, adherents. And therefore, Jeremiah's appeal to, it must have been true in order to join those dots, is just not convincing. And it doesn't address the point at all. The point being, but there's lots of other things that people think passionately and changes their lives. So, but that presumably aren't true, or at least that we wouldn't think that they're all true. So therefore, couldn't this have also happened in the case of the apostles? And the answer is simply, well, no, because they changed from being scared to not scared and really believing. And therefore, that what you're saying could have happened. He doesn't actually, the point is, he doesn't explain why it couldn't have happened. He just reasserts his point. His point is, only a true resurrection could have changed the disciples' mental states. And his evidence for that is the fact that they changed their mental states. Do you see how this is completely hollow and insubstantial as an argument? He doesn't try to explain why it is that his postulated mechanism for change, namely a resurrection witnessed by they didn't witness the resurrection, but a resurrection body witnessed by the disciples. He doesn't try to explain why that is the only or even the best explanation. He just asserts it again when specifically challenged by Sean. That's why this has no substance as an argument at all. It's not that it's a bad argument. It's not an argument. He just reasserted his contention when called out on the key argument that he's giving for it. Yeah, another good point here by Skeptics and Scoundrels. Running scared is not the same as apostasy, right? But I mean, I'm just sort of giving him giving Jeremiah the benefit of the doubt, because I don't actually accept his characterization of the mental state of the apostles, nor should we, because we shouldn't just trust everything the gospel says, but we'll get more to that later. But even if you kind of just grant that description, it still doesn't make sense, because he hasn't explained why the change must have been wrought by the disciples observing a real resurrection, particularly because in other cases, we know that wasn't the case. So why couldn't that have been the case here? There's just no effort to actually join the dots there.
Again, I can go directly from that experience. They didn't want it to be true. No one in nascent Judaism was expecting them. This is another thing we should really point out, Sean. When we read the scriptures, we can't do so anachronistically. It's easy to say, oh yeah, Jesus, he died, and he died on the Roman cross. Very few Jews in the time of Jesus expected their Messiah to die. In
Right.
fact, we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls and any other writings from late antiquity, late Second Temple Judaism, they expected the Messiah to show up and kill all the Romans, even kill the Roman emperor. So don't give me this message that our Savior is going to be crucified. He would have been thought of as a failure. So, and that's where we get into later in our interview, I'm sure. If they wanted to start with this narrative, it was a non-starter in the Roman Empire. If they wanted to make this up in some kind of wish-filled utopia.
Yeah, so this is actually evidence against the truth of Christianity. Remember that Christianity holds that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and yet we see increasingly, and Jeremiah is saying this here as well, others like N.T. Wright have also made this point, that in fact Jesus does not meet the criteria for the Jewish Messiah, at least as anyone understood it at the time, only by retroactively refitting and reinterpreting the Old Testament in the light of Christian teachings and the resurrection beliefs and so forth, which is exactly what Jeremiah said here. He just literally said, no, you actually can't reasonably get, or you won't reasonably get the the crucifixion and the resurrection out of the Old Testament unless you already go back looking at it from that point of view, right? And so this is actually evidence against the hypothesis of Christianity that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, because all of the events surrounding that have to be retrofitted into what the Old Testament says. It doesn't naturally follow from that. It's not what you would reasonably expect or predict, and it's not what any of the Jews at the time expected or predicted. It's not what most Jews today how they understand their religious writings. So that's evidence against the hypothesis that Jesus is a Jewish Messiah. I've yet to hear an argument as to why that is not a reasonable interpretation. That is, why, if you have theology that teaches this and then something different happens, that even Christians agree, yeah, it's different and it's not what people originally thought or understood, how that cannot be evidence against, maybe not decisive, but at least evidence against that theology being true. It's just like when Christians say, oh, but there's things in the Book of Mormon that contradict what it says in the Bible, and therefore the Book of Mormon must be false. But of course, Mormons just say, oh, well, no, but you have to interpret the Bible through the Book of Mormon, and then it actually is completely coherent and makes sense. Mainstream Christians don't accept that sort of argument. And likewise, mainstream Jews don't accept the Christian argument that you have to reinterpret what the Old Testament says about the Messiah through the lens of Jesus. That's just retrofitting ad hoc, wishful thinking, effectively, from my point of view, about what the texts actually say. The fact of the matter is that Jesus's death and crucifixion and resurrection doesn't fit into a traditional Jewish theology really at all, and that is evidence against it being actually of God, or at least actually fitting into that framework. But somehow this is spun into evidence in favor, which I've just sort of never understood. Now, the other point that's being made here, by the way, is that it is not something that that Jesus' followers would have made up. Now, this is another example of the very prevalent, extremely black and white thinking that a lot of apologists have for some reason about, well, just, I don't know, things in general, but particularly thinking about like religious movements and new religious traditions, that either it's entirely factual, literal, like if you had a video camera, this is what it would be. That's a slight exaggeration, but not very much of an exaggeration for what a lot of the apologists say. Or at the other end, it was entirely invented and made up deliberately as a lie intentionally. There is no reason at all to accept that these are the two possibilities. And for most things in life are not so simple. And in this case, I think that the way that we should think about this is that the disciples tried to make sense of their experiences in the best way that they knew how, consistent with the acculturation and practices of their times, consistent with and limited by their own cognitive biases, limitations, and socialization, and also affected by factors like memory distortion, wish fulfillment, motivated reasoning, and things like that, right? So it's not a question of they made it all up or it's all true. The question is, can we explain how they would have come to believe these things without postulating a resurrection? And I think that we very easily can. I've talked about some of the mechanisms psychologically and sociologically that I think were at work here in my book, Unreasonable Faith. So you can check that out if you want more details. I won't go into all that here. Apologists almost never discuss these. Things like what I sort of mentioned, like bereavement hallucination could be one factor. Memory distortion, socialization in religious experiences, motivated reasoning, irrational belief persistence, cognitive dissonance, and all of these sorts of other factors, right, that shape the way people form beliefs and develop, particularly in highly emotionally and sort of spiritually charged environments like new religious movements. And you can see these sorts of dynamics in many new religious movements and high intensity groups throughout history. And so the idea that early Christianity was somehow different and none of these factors existed there or were at work is really just bizarre. And I just don't really know how apologists get away with just sort of pretending that somehow early Christianity was full of hyper-rationalists who only ever follows the strict Bayesian letter of what they should believe on the basis of the evidence, and were not subject to all of the distortion, especially when this is a pre-modern, pre-literate society we're talking about. But you don't even need to appeal to that, because there's enough evidence from even today about how these things actually work in practice in these sorts of new religious settings. And so I just why do we need to think that it was all made up? No, I don't think it was all made up and that they sat down and planned out what would be the most successful, most persuasive thing that they could cook up. That's ridiculous, right? But I don't know that anyone seriously advocates. I don't know, maybe there's an atheist somewhere who said that. But that's not the most reasonable explanation. The most reasonable explanation is something like what I discuss in my book, where it's some combination of sociological and psychological phenomena that led them to that gave rise to this belief. And of course, again, we don't have to think that everything that it says in the Gospels is literally what occurred either. We should have some skepticism about that, but we'll sort of come back to that. But the point of this is don't be suckered in. Don't allow yourself to accept this dichotomy of literally historically true to the last T, or completely made up and deliberately invented as a lie. There's no reason to accept that dichotomy. It's almost always somewhere in the middle, in that no, they didn't sit down and make it up, but they were influenced by things that really did happen, and then they interpreted in certain ways and so forth, right? And, you could even be a Christian and agree with that and just think that there was more historicity to it, right, than I think there was. So, there's room for disagreement on exactly how much bad faith there was or exactly how much real experience there was and so forth. But the main point there is don't accept this absurd dichotomy, because it's just not going to help you to think about this or really understand, well, really much of anything in the world, to be honest.
It just would have fallen on deaf ears.
We are going to get to that. That's point number 4, where you make a fresh argument. And then we're going to take some questions. I already see some great questions lined up here. Can't wait to get to them. But let's move to reason number 2. You say Jesus called it, meaning he predicted it.
Oh, gosh,
go.
There are modern skeptics, some that are darlings, that say, Jesus didn't really know what he was doing. He certainly didn't claim to be God. He wasn't that sure of his messianic agenda. People who came later deified him, and in so doing put words in his mouth. But what does the scripture actually show us when we open the New Testament documents? And I believe that the New Testament documents are historical documents. I don't privilege the biblical text. I mean, okay. Sean, when I was in Oxford at Keble College.
Okay, so it's clear that he doesn't privilege the New Testament text. He treats them as historical documents. Okay, so that's good. So remember how we should treat historical documents, especially ones that are anonymous and written decades after the fact. We should treat them as useful sources, but that need corroboration and that need to be treated skeptically on thinking about, who may have written them, what purpose may they have written them for, what sources were they using that informed their writings, how do they fit with other sources that we'd be given, and I know that there are New Testament scholars who think about all this, right? But I'm talking about this specific context here. He has said that he treats them like other historical documents. So this is the way that you should treat a historical document, particularly of this sort of historical documents, right? As a useful source, but subject to quite a bit of skepticism, given that there's a need to corroborate the claim and a lack of clarity about exactly who made the claim and what the evidence was, right? So, if I was reading, just to put that in some context, if I was reading a book today and it made a claim about what happened, I don't know, in, let's say, in Sri Lanka 5 years ago, and it said, I don't know, some political event happened, like there was a coup or whatever. I would generally expect that there is some source for that claim. I mean, I suppose events that are very well known aren't always sourced, right? But let's say it's a little bit more obscure. So I would expect to have some sort of citation and some basis for that. And I'd expect to be able to look back, if I so care to, and find newspaper evidence of this, and to find other sources talking about this, and to be able to see that different people had discussed it, and particularly how the sources trace back to the original event, like from newspaper articles or press announcements, and maybe even photographs and other things from the event. I mean, there's different types of sources you can have, obviously, depending on how far back you're going in history. The point is, I'd expect to trace that evidence back to the source in some way. Now, somehow that's not required for the New Testament documents. There's no requirement from many apologists, at least, to trace the evidence back. Well, they'll sort of trace it back through Paul, right? But the problem is Paul didn't write the Gospels and wasn't an eyewitness to any of these events. So that doesn't really help. Maybe that gets you the creed, but it doesn't get you any of the gospel narratives. So they kind of just make up where the sources are from, because no one actually knows, right? It's not preserved in the Gospels. It's just preserved through oral tradition, which itself you can ask, well, what's the basis of that? So the point is, it is very reasonable to be skeptical about these texts, because we don't know the provenance of the information. We don't know how the information was collected in the first place, preserved for several decades, and then transmitted to the people who wrote the Gospels, and in what manner that was conducted, in what manner it was recorded and synthesized, and what the goal of that was. And those are very reasonable questions to have when interpreting any text. Like, forget about whether it's even an ancient text, forget about whether it's a biblical text. Any text, you want to think about those questions skeptically. So those are the sorts of things that I would expect to be motivating and underpinning Jeremiah's approach when he interprets biblical text. So let's bear that in mind, that that's a reasonable skeptical approach to take to text if you're treating them just like any other historical text. Let's see if he meets something like that standard.
College at Faculty of Theology with Marcus Bachmuel, they made it very clear that you should not privilege the text of the Bible but carry out your arguments. And one thing that these historical documents that make up the New Testament show us is that Jesus, in fact, did predict his death and resurrection. Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31, Mark 10:33 and 34, and Mark 14, when Jesus is asked, by the scholars, the nomikos, the scribes, the grammatus in Greek, who are you, Jesus? And, tell us, why have you come? And we hear it in Greek. He would have said it in Aramaic, but in Greek, it comes out, ego eimi, I am. Jesus is making a distinctive claim to deity linked with Yahweh of the Old Testament. And he says, I'm going to give you one sign. It's the sign of Jonah. I'm going to rise from the dead. And he did that. So he called it, I said, again, for those that are just.
Well, that's interesting. So Jeremiah says he doesn't privilege the New Testament documents. He treats them like any other historical text. Okay, that's good. And therefore, his evidence that Jesus predicted being resurrected is that in one of these documents, which was written to persuade, we know that these were written to persuade people to believe in Jesus. It says that Jesus predicted that he would raise from the dead. Okay, well that's interesting. So we just okay. So how do we know that Jesus said that? Is it just because it says it in Mark? Like, is that's enough? Is it just because it says it there? That's enough. All right. Well, if that's your standard, I mean, it doesn't sound like, Jeremiah, that you're actually treating these as just any other historical document that needs corroboration and is treated critically. And you think about, well, what's the purpose of this and why they're making this claim and where they got this information from. He even said Jesus would have said this in Aramaic, but it's written in Greek. Well, that's interesting. Who was responsible for preserving the teachings in Aramaic and then eventually translating them into Greek? Who was responsible for that? And how did they make the translation? Because that's an important question, right? What were the standards for translation? How do we know that the Greek we have accurately reflects the Aramaic that Jesus allegedly spoke? I mean, even that question by itself is an interesting question, even if everything else about the transmission of the information of the teachings or the events was completely transparent and completely known. How the translation was made itself is important. But of course, there's all the other issues, like, well, who heard Jesus say this, and then how did that information go to the author of the gospel? Of course, allegedly, I forget which disciple Mark was supposed to be associated with. Was that Peter? I don't care. One of the disciples is supposed to be associated with, and then apparently Peter just remembered all of this stuff very accurately, and then told it to the author of Mark, who wrote it down several decades later and translated into Greek at the same time. Even if you buy that, it's still kind of suspect. Because Peter's remembering this from or whichever source he's getting this from. He's remembering this from a long time ago. A lot's happened since then. How do you know his memory hasn't been colored by things that happened beforehand? Sorry. How do you know his memory hasn't been colored by things that happened afterwards? Maybe he's misremembering some of the things that Jesus said in a way that is maybe loading a bit more on interpreting them as a prediction. Because, of course, by the time this detail is being reported, Jesus has already been resurrected. At least that's what they believe, right? So how do you know that that's not coloring their memory? Even if they're being completely honest, and even if they're getting direct eyewitness testimony, how do you know that that's not coloring what they've remembered and what they're reporting? And then there's the translation issue, which I mentioned. And that's assuming that they're getting this firsthand from eyewitnesses, which I don't think that they did. There's so many issues here about whether you how you interpret the fact that it says in some of these texts, arguably that Jesus claims to have been God. But we don't get any of that. We just get complete uncritical acceptance of apparently any detail that it says in the gospel. We'll see later that he appeals to many others. Is that treating them like any other historical document? It almost seems, Jeremiah, that he's just sort of said that he treats them no differently from other historical documents to get kind of street cred or academic cred, I suppose it would be in this case. But then he doesn't actually follow through because he doesn't show any ounce of skepticism or any reasonable scholarly question is asked, whatever, about appealing to this critical piece. This isn't an incidental point. This is critical in reason number 2, which is that Jesus said so. He doesn't even try to convince us that Jesus said so. He just appeals to the texts of the very religion that hinges on this point, as if we will be convinced. Imagine if an Islamic scholar tried to convince us that Muhammad was the final and ultimate messenger of God by appealing to a passage from the Quran where Muhammad said that he was the greatest and last messenger of God. Would anyone find that convincing who was not already a Muslim? I don't think they would, unless you could establish very clearly on independent grounds that that he actually did say that, and that was inspired by God or something like that. So it's hard to understand why anyone would even say this, unless, of course, the goal is not actually to convince anyone who doesn't believe or is skeptical, but actually just to sort of stopper up the doubts of people who already believe.
Just joining us, perhaps you're new to Christianity. If Christianity had a hashtag, it would have been on the third day. Jesus does something that no one else could do. He messianizes Hosea 6. On the third day you will raise this up, and that's one of Jesus's darling passages, Hosea 6:2, where he imports that into his messianic agenda. He messianizes that passage. He applies it to himself, and so.
How does Jeremiah know that that's one of Jesus's favorite passages? Does he have an independent record of what Jesus said, or does he only have that filtered through these texts? Because if it's filtered through, which of course I know the answer is, if that's true, then again, we want to ask some questions about how these texts were composed and what their source of evidence was, and maybe whether there are other reasons why certain things are recorded as being teachings of Jesus, independently from them actually being teachings of Jesus, or at least maybe they've been altered somewhat through memory or through theology, so to speak, in there, which we absolutely know the gospel authors did, because sometimes I misquote the Old Testament and so forth and use it in particular ways. Or maybe that's Paul who does that more. But either way, it's still we know that they made particular points for theological reasons. The birth narratives are one of the clearest examples of this, which are just obvious inventions and cannot possibly be historical. But so we know that this happened and that this was sort of considered acceptable practice at the time, because the genre of text is not one that we would understand today, in which we would expect that every detail would be reported accurately, as if as if you could kind of video camera it. Whereas it doesn't seem to me that there was any expectation of that in the ancient world. Anyway, we could go on about that, but the point is that there's just no skepticism or any questions raised whatever about the content of the Gospels with respect to reporting Jesus' teachings. Apparently, it's just like Jesus wrote them himself, immediately after it happened, and therefore, if it says that Jesus said this, then he said it. Case closed.
So we hear, Sean, if you and I were observant Jews in the first century, we would have heard exactly what Jesus was doing. We would have been very familiar with Hosea and his promise of Hosea 6. We would have interpreted it at the time as certainly a general resurrection in the future. Jesus said, no, on the third day, I will rise again. And
that's interesting. So remember that Jeremiah says here that if we were observant Jews at the time, we would have clearly understood that Jesus was saying that he would rise again on the third day. Remember that. Observant Jews at the time would have clearly understood that Jesus predicted that he would rise on the third day.
So he called it. And why is it important? Why is that one of the threads of our body of evidence? Because if Jesus didn't really know what he was doing, then what's the point after all? No, Jesus makes it clear in the oldest documents that we have for New Testament nascent Christianity that no, he intended to die. He was giving the sign of Jonah, and then he adumbrated that. Which I only use 2 reasons from Scripture out of 7, by the way. It's this one and the next one. Not only did Jesus call it, but we roll right into reason number 3. We see adumbrations. That's a very important word, of resuscitations, and I use that word carefully. I bring interpretive perspectives.
Now, hang on before we get to number 3. You were the first person to use the word adumbrated or adumbrations in one of my live streams. So congratulations. That is an SAT word. Nice job. Let me throw one objection at you.
Yes, because using long words in itself is an accomplishment.
Before we move on to number 3. So you're making the argument that scholars would accept, you said Mark 8, 9, and 10, typically understood as the early written Gospels, that Jesus predicted his resurrection.
Most scholars do not accept that, right? Show me some evidence that most scholars accept that Jesus actually predicted that he would rise from the dead on the third day. I don't believe it. I don't believe that most scholars think that. That's ridiculous. Show me the evidence.
The flip side to that Dale Allison points out in his recent book, in which he defends some of the resurrection but offers some critiques. He says, wait a minute, if Jesus so clearly predicted his resurrection, then why are the apostles so confused? Why won't Thomas believe for 8 days when his buddies, the apostles, say, we saw the risen Jesus? Why this lack of belief if he so clearly predicted it?
I have huge respect for Dale Allison and his commentary series and his work on the resurrection. We've had him speak and interacted with him as well in the scholarly work. But if I could just elbow in scholarly for a minute, I would just say this. What
the heck is that? If I can just elbow in scholarly, what is this? What are you doing? What is that? Just answer the question. What was all of that? Is that chest pump? I don't know what that was. It was so weird. Just answer the question.
would be impossible for us to essentially, again, anachronistically go in and say, how did they believe this? We can't get into the disciples' head. They didn't believe a lot of things, and let alone the resurrection. I mean, that's where I see myself in the disciples. They had trouble and very, very much misunderstood the Messianic program. I know this show is
Okay, so just remember how like 2 minutes ago he said that if we were an observant Jew in the first century, we would have clearly understood that Jesus's reference to, what was it, Hosea or whatever, was him saying that Jesus would rise again on the third day. Now, almost in the next breath, he's saying, well, actually, the disciples, though, they didn't really understand it because they were kind of dumb. So which is it, Jeremiah? Was it so clear that any observant Jew could have told it? In which case, why didn't the disciples understand it? Or was it not so clear, such that a whole bunch of observant Jews who knew Jesus very well and apparently heard him say this multiple times didn't figure it out? In which case, was it really so clear in the first place? And is it actually reasonable that he said this? And by the way, this point about whether Jesus actually, like, I don't think Jesus predicted that he would be resurrected, but if he actually did, then that would be evidence for, that could be evidence that the whole thing was contrived by some of his followers, or maybe even people who weren't directly his followers. I don't know why apologists always assume that if say the body was stolen, for example, that it must have been the apostles who did it. Why couldn't it have just been someone else who was, I mean, there's tomb robbery, this is a possibility, but maybe just some more loosely connected followers who, like followers of Jesus who observed from afar or whatever and sort of figured out where the tomb was, or observed where his body was taken, and decided to steal it for who knows what theological reasons or selfish motivation or relic hunting or whatever exactly was going on in their minds. But the point is, if that happened, partly perhaps on the basis of the fact that maybe they believed that they were carrying out Jesus's wishes in taking his body from the tomb so that the resurrection could be facilitated, or that would be the resurrection. You know, people come up with all sorts of stuff, right? The point is that this is made more likely. I mean, that could have happened anyway, but this is made more likely if Jesus actually did predict his resurrection, because then it's in people's minds, right, to actually bring it about. And so in my mind, if Jesus really did predict this, it actually is evidence against it happening. Maybe not super strong evidence, but it's much more convincing if someone makes a prediction that comes to pass, which is something they could not directly or indirectly have caused to bring about. Like if I make a prediction and the fact that I made that prediction makes it, can make it possible or makes it more likely that that prediction actually comes true, that's not very convincing, is it? Like if a public figure says, I predict that this building will be vandalized within the next week, and then some of his followers or just some radical crazy people go and vandalize the building, that's not an impressive prediction, because the fact that he made that prediction is what caused that to have happened, right? Likewise, if Jesus really did go around teaching clearly and unambiguously that he would be raised on the third day, then it's not at all unreasonable that could have motivated someone or some people to have stolen his body to bring that about, or in belief that was what he wanted or something like that. So it doesn't help the point, right? To say that he predicted that. A prediction is only impressive if the prediction came true and can be established that he actually made it, of course, which can't, but also, and this is critical, that the act of making the prediction could not reasonably have brought about the fulfillment of that prediction. And so, if Jesus predicted, a solar eclipse, and then it happened, and there's no earthly way that he could know that would be impressive, right? Because presumably Jesus as a human could not have brought about a solar eclipse. So that would be impressive, right? There's actually quite a lot of things that you could predict and not as a man, as a person yourself bring about directly or indirectly. And that would actually be at least evidence that there's, I don't know, something supernormal or supernatural going on. But Jesus' prediction wasn't that. Jesus' prediction was effectively that he would raise from the dead. Well, if you could actually show that Jesus raised from the dead, that would be supernatural, right? But we don't have that. What we have is reports of people seeing him raise from the dead. And if that was triggered by, say, an empty tomb, then we have a problem here, that the prediction could have actually led to people stealing the body. But even aside from stealing the body, there's the fact that Jesus' disciples, even if they didn't understand at the time what Jesus meant, later on they realized, wait, he was talking about being raised from the dead. And then that expectation triggers the appearances, right? This is the whole problem, that the prediction that Jesus made doesn't have to have been understood by the disciples at the time that he made it, or even immediately after dying. It only has to have been understood by them to refer to him having risen from the dead at some point between the crucifixion and the Gospels being written, really. I mean, I suppose you might say, well, it has to have happened before Paul got the early creeds, which is like several years afterwards. But even then, there's several years' time in which the apostles could have come to this understanding that actually Jesus was talking about this, him rising from the dead. And that expectation is what triggered their initial appearances. I think their initial appearances and like seeing of risen Jesus were probably triggered by the empty tomb. But I'm saying, even if you don't think that, the fact that Jesus, if you think that Jesus really did predict his resurrection after the third day, then that prediction could have led to the disciples' belief in the resurrection. And so that actually makes it less, it's actually evidence against the resurrection. Now, fortunately for Christians, I don't actually think Jesus did predict his resurrection. So I don't think this is actually evidence against the resurrection. What I'm saying is, if he really did, that would be evidence against it, because it would increase the likelihood that people would steal the body, or that the disciples would at some point come to understand that he would have well, they probably would have already understood, or would later come to understand that that's what he meant, and that therefore that could have triggered their belief in the resurrection. We don't have to accept the absurd binary of the apologist that, well, that because the disciples didn't initially believe it, that therefore initially understand what Jesus was saying about being resurrected, that therefore at no point did they ever come to understand that until they actually had the experiences. That's an absurd inference, right? There's no basis for saying that because at one point they didn't understand it, that therefore they never could have understood that that's what Jesus meant. That's ridiculous. And therefore, we should reject that inference and say that actually, if Jesus really did predict his resurrection, that is evidence against the resurrection being having actually taken place, because it increases the likelihood that people would have come to believe that he did for separate reasons. So I don't think that's that hard to think through. You just sort of have to piece the logic together. Like, well, if there really was a prediction, then doesn't that like make these other psychological factors more likely to work? Whereas as compared to the situation where no one had even thought of it before and it was just completely left field, well, then that's actually less likely that people would have come up with the belief.
About Judas, but I'm of the firm opinion, and I've published this, that Judas simply didn't get the Jesus program when to the cross. And so, that's almost for me an argument from silence. And that, well, why didn't they get it? I mean, are you telling me they didn't really understand what he was saying? Yeah, we're telling you they really didn't understand.
Yeah. So despite how clear Jesus allegedly was to a devout Jew that he said just like 2 minutes ago, now the disciples actually just didn't understand Jesus at all. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me, but whatever.
And again, we would have to make sure to think of ourselves in Jesus's world of Judaica. No one was going to the cross who was considered to be a savior. I mean, this was an outlier. And so I just can't come back more carefully enough to that point. That's something I learned back in 2009, Sean. Reading as a new believer at the time, as a what I would call a baby believer, I just thought, well, yeah, every Jew thought Jesus was going to die on the cross. So, look at Isaiah 53. Well, Isaiah 53's interpretive context has grown a lot in light of the resurrection. And
what? Are you saying that you can't take Isaiah 53 as a prediction of Jesus's resurrection because you can only read that into it after the fact, that's not actually reasonable to treat that as a prophecy because you're taking the fact of what happens and reading it back into it? That's shocking. Okay, that's not exactly what he said, but I think that's a reasonable inference from it. This is the problem, that nothing in the Old Testament can reasonably be taken as supportive of the Christian theology about Jesus being the Jewish Messiah, because it just flatly is inconsistent with it. And the only way to get around that is to read it back into it from the vantage point of already believing in Christian theology and looking backwards. And this is the problem. This is evidence against the truth of Christian theology because it isn't consistent with what the Old Testament has to say about the Messiah.
For it, we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sons of Kittim, the Romans, will be killed by this coming Messiah. So, we could talk about that at length, but again, there are a lot of things. I say this as a gospel scholar. A PhD knows a lot about a little. There were a lot of.
He talks a lot about how he's a scholar and a PhD, and goes to conferences and this. I just find this immensely cringe. Just give us your arguments. I don't care about your credentials. That doesn't mean anything.
Other things, the gospel's just
okay. It means something. You know what I mean.
The gospel writers just didn't understand. The disciples didn't get at the time. And I think that's why Judas fell out of the boat.
Mm-hmm. Good correction. The last one we want to confuse is Judas with Jesus. So
yes.
Excellent correction at the end. Good job. And great answer, by the way. That's really helpful. Let's move to number 3. Those of you who join us, we're here with Dr. Jeremiah Johnson, has a new book called Body Proof, where he walks through what he thinks are the 7 best reasons for the resurrection. Number 3, you said Jesus demonstrated resurrection power. Go.
Absolutely. And this is number 3, because if Jesus can proclaim that he's going to be resurrected himself, that he is the resurrection and life, he better prove that he can actually do this, that he has power over death. And we actually see again, there are 8 resurrections, by the way, in the scriptures. There are 3 in the Old Testament. Jesus performs 3. Then we have 2 in the book of Acts. And Jesus, I use this word adumbrations. He adumbrates. a popular, he foreshadows his forthcoming resurrection by raising recently dead individuals from the grave. Now, I make an interpretive distinction in my new book, Body of Proof, Sean. And again, this is what I've learned along the way. We can use emic and etic categories. We can bring certain language to the text that helps us have more precision in our interpretive tradition. And so, for example,
I didn't pick that up when I first read. I think he says emic and etic. I think I pronounce that as emic and etic. Maybe I've actually got the pronunciation wrong. This says emic. But anyway, yeah, that's to do with like the way you interpret texts. But anyway, I guess the point is, why does he use this jargon? People aren't going to understand what he's saying. Like, just try to explain it clearly. It just irritates me.
Example, like Trinity is not, we all know, is not
Sure.
in the Bible. When I say that Jesus resuscitated 3 individuals in the New Testament, showing that he had power over resurrection, I'm speaking about the widow of Nain's son. I'm thinking about Jairus' daughter. I'm thinking about John 11, Lazarus, his good friend who could not have been more dead in the Jewish motif, dead 4 days. Jesus is showing that he has power over death, but these individuals would die twice. I give a fun lecture, Resurrection and Those Who Die Twice. In fact, did you know?
Okay, so we've got more appeals to events that are mentioned in the New Testament. Actually, he mentioned that there are 3 resurrections in the Old Testament. I'm actually not sure which ones he's appealing to there. But that's interesting, because if people other than Jesus can have power over death, then doesn't that imply that Jesus doesn't need to be the Son of God? I don't actually know. I don't know what cases he's appealing to there. The other thing is, of course, well, Jeremiah, how do you know that these things happened? Just because it says so in the New Testament? It's not very. We've already gone through all that, so I won't reiterate those points. Now, what I do want to comment on is this, because this is another point of embarrassment for apologists, because I want to say that Jesus' resurrection was unique and special in history, but then there seem to be other resurrections in the Gospels. And this is a problem, like, and I think Axie mentioned as well, so like the New Testament broadly. So how do we explain that if Jesus' resurrection is supposed to be special? Well, they get around this by having a distinction. There's resuscitations, which they sometimes call resurrections, but are technically actually different, right? Because the person's brought back to a flawed and corrupted body, one that will eventually die again. So they're brought back to life, but just ordinary life. Whereas Jesus' resurrection was special because it's the only case where someone was brought back to a sort of a perfected and an incorrupted body, which will not die. So that's interesting. One question I have is, what basis is there for this distinction in the text itself, or in like, say, other first century Christian teachings? Because I don't think there is any. I don't think that it says this in the actual text. I think this is something that Christians have, let's see, developed an interpretive framework for subsequently, or in other words, made up. Now, I could be wrong there, and if I'm wrong, then I'm sure I'll be corrected. But I think that this is just a post hoc rationalization for how to distinguish Jesus' resurrection from these other resurrections. What basis is there in the text for drawing this distinction? The other point I would make is that let's suppose there is this distinction. What does this show? Like, why is that proof that Jesus has power over death? Because he, like, shittily resurrects some people into like a corrupted life, a corrupted body, but like reserves to himself the like proper resurrection. I guess there's theological reasons that they justify why he does that, but like, I just don't get it. Why is that evidence for anything? Like, suppose that there were not just 2 types of resurrections, there were 3 or 4 or 20. Like, wouldn't those just be equally consistent with, or that there was only one type of resurrection and it was always the same? I just don't understand what relevance is this to anything. How is this expected under the hypothesis that Jesus really does have power over death? That there's like 3 examples of like a sort of resurrection, but then they're still going to die. I don't get it. Like, why is this evidence? It just doesn't explain why that's more expected under one hypothesis than the other.
That Lazarus has 2 different burial spots. He has one, of course, in Bethany and another in Cyprus. Did you know you can go to the island of Cyprus today and you can go to the second burial spot of Lazarus because he would die again, as would Jairus' daughter.
Yes, and I'm sure that that's got a good historical credential as well, that that's actually the burial of the person mentioned in the Gospels. But whatever, we don't need to go down that road.
As would the widow of Nain's son. Jesus is the first fruits of resurrection to have an undieable body, to have a deathless body. But Jesus still showed us he had power over death by performing those resuscitations. Now, do I believe they actually died? Am I claiming that they didn't die using the word resuscitation? Of course not. I'm claiming, yes, they were dead. And one of them, probably the widow of Nain's son, had died either that day or he had died the night before. In Jewish burial traditions, if you died that day before sundown, you were buried that day. If you died during the night, you were buried the very next day. So, the fact that Jesus would put his hand on the bier, touch the bier, and the boy who was dead, Luke's gospel records, stood up in the burial procession, this would have been shocking. So I think it's important that Jesus...
Yeah, I think it would have been shocking if someone who was dead stood up. I don't think that there's any argument there. The question is, did it happen? Well, I mean, it says so in the Gospel of Luke, so who might argue with that?
Jesus foreshadows or adumbrates.
Remember, the Gospels are just treated like any other historical source. They're not special. Remember that. So when they say that people rose from the dead, just like if any other historical source said someone raised from the dead, I would just believe that because it's in the text, right? That's how I treat any historical text. It says, if it says something, including if people rose from the dead or other miracles, I just believe that, right? So likewise, when I see that in the Gospels, I just believe that.
His power over death. And I just want to mention, if anyone's just joining us right now, only 2 of my 7 reasons emanate out of the scriptures per se. The rest of them are other evidences that we will get to.
And one of the things you do, which we won't do here.
Although they need to appeal to the New Testament evidence because they have almost nothing else. They're still, apologists, at least many of them, are still kind of embarrassed at doing so because they realize that is just really pathetic in convincing anyone of anything. That's like the Mormon appealing to the Book of Mormon, or the writings of Joseph Smith, or the Muslim appealing to the Quran, or Buddhists appealing to the teachings of the Buddha to establish the truth of those doctrines so taught. It's really not very convincing. So they desire to have extra biblical sources, although, as it turns out, many of these extra biblical sources or evidences are either not evidence at all, or actually turn out to be just based on the Bible in the same way, or directly or indirectly. So we'll see that in a moment.
Here is elsewhere lay out a case for the reliability of the scriptures, even if the scriptures aren't inspired or reliable.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't really understand how this is supposed to work. So apparently, power over death. The fact that the Gospels say that Jesus had power over death is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, if I accepted that sort of argument, I would just turn to the part of the Gospels where it says, Jesus rose from the dead, or the disciples saw him, and then I would just believe that, right? Although interestingly, the very oldest extant documents of Mark don't even have that bit in them, so there's something to chew on. But nonetheless, of course, Mark and Luke and Matthew, Luke and John do have that part in them. So I just turn to that and say, oh well, that's what the Gospels say. So I just don't know what is added by saying, well, if you turn to this part of the Gospel, it says this, and then inferring from that, we can say that, well, Jesus had power of death, so he was resurrected. Well, why not just turn to like 3 pages later when it says he was resurrected? Like, isn't that simpler? Like, you could just have one reason, like just turn to the page where it says this. I know that Pine Creek has already made this argument, but of course, it bears repeating because it's just, it's kind of weird.
Bible as a whole, there's certain texts and passages that scholars accept that back up and make these points. So if people want that, they're gonna have to go to your scholarly work to find it. I'm seeing some great comments, some great questions. We will come to these. But number 4, Dr. J, you better bring the goods, man. I mean, you said this is a fresh argument, as far as you can tell.
So the first 3, if I remember correctly, the first one was that Christianity and the other people who believed it changed their lives and changed society as a result of believing it. So we already looked at how that's just an absurdly ridiculous argument because we haven't been shown why that makes it more likely to be true. The second 2 were just basically appeals to it says so in the Bible, or specifically the New Testament. So none of these are slightly new or really compelling in any way. So let's see what number 4 is.
I'm giving you this platform. I'm partly messing with you. I put you here because I read it and I thought, you know what? I teach a class on the resurrection.
Okay, so this is actually a good question from Dov Rob. Do you think appealing to the Hadith is just as fallacious as appealing to the Book of Mormon or Bible? And it sort of depends what you're appealing to, but I actually don't. I've a lot more respect for Hadith. So the Hadith are traditions about the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad and like his early followers, I guess. The thing about Hadith is that there's no one set of Hadith. There are many Hadith, and they have different levels of like authentication, I guess. I forget the exact word that's used. But the thing about them that I respect a lot more is that they actually at least attempt to, I can't speak to how successful this is, they attempt to cite their sources because each Hadith is at least supposed to, like the source ones will say, like, so-and-so heard from so-and-so who heard from so-and-so who heard from the prophet or who was there with the prophet, right? That they have the kind of chain of references built into it as part of it and how it was passed on, and on the basis of like how reliable the people were and what their reputations were and how many different sources it has, the Hadith are graded as being like more or less reliable. That to me, I mean, it's still built on the fallibility of memory, and there's other things that can cause skepticism there. But to me, that is so much better than anything that we have in the New Testament, which is just anonymous, sourceless documents from decades later. We don't know who wrote them or what their sources were. At least for many of the Hadith, they claim to they at least cite their sources, whether you believe them or you can question their reliability. But at least they sort of try to do that, right? So I actually think that there's something to be said about Hadith. Of course, at the end of the day, it's still people saying stuff, right? And you can question there's still all of the other sociological and psychological factors that go into that. But I kind of like that, because and this is exactly the sort of thing that Muslim apologists say, by the way, that like the Hadith are a way better source than like anything in the New Testament, or at least a lot of things in the New Testament. I guess Paul is pretty well sourced, because we have like we know that he was the author of those, and but for the gospel authors, like we don't know where that information comes from. Anyway, but I think that's an interesting aside. By the way, if God really was the divine author of all of this, he could have engineered these sources to be so much better and so much clearer than they actually are. Just imagine what you might expect if God really wanted generations following Jesus to be very confident, and particularly scholars in later like in centuries following, to be very confident and clear about what Jesus said and what his disciples taught. They could have written it down, like the year of the crucifixion in like stone tablets, which were preserved in Egypt or something like that. Like there's so many things that it could have happened, which happened in other cases, but we don't have. Like could have happened and could have easily happened for an omnipotent God, but don't. Well, why not? Well, I suggest it's because there is no divine inspiration, and this is all just men writing things and teaching things and going about their business as they normally do, and they don't actually have access to these powers and influences that would enable them to preserve the evidence much better than they actually manage to themselves. Food for thought. But anyway, let's get back to the video.
And at least the way you approach this is unique. So I do think it's fresh as far as I'm aware. But here's what you say. And then those of you watching, give him time to unpack what he means. Please. Reason number 4, Jesus rose from the grave. No motivation to invent Jesus' resurrection narrative is evident. Explain.
Judaism in the time of Jesus is a coherent religion. There were other great rabbis and teachers who were loved, who were honored, and who were remembered. And any Jew, if you and I lived in first century Judaism, we would have honored our rabbi or this great teacher. And sure enough, yes, we would have believed this great Jewish teacher would rise again someday in the general resurrection. Sean, if you and I were followers of a rabbi called James, and so-called James is really a great, phenomenal guy, he even might do some miracles. He might even have some interesting stories about his origins. And he dies. We can honor our rabbi James. We can believe that he will live again in the general resurrection. Absolutely. And we can carry on even his teaching. We have no psychological motivation to invent a resurrection narrative about our rabbi, because we don't need it. Because Judaism is a coherent religion, we already believe in resurrection. We'll just get there a different way. In the general resurrection someday, when all Jews are risen from the dead, our rabbi, who we hold in high esteem and who we very much appreciate the impact he's made on the world and on our own lives, sure, he's going to be in heaven. But the disciples went further than that, didn't
Okay, so first of all, I don't know what he means by coherent religion. Could he give an example of what an incoherent religion is and what the word coherent is doing there? Maybe it's not really doing anything. I just find it a bit odd. But put that to the side. What Jeremiah seems to be saying here is that because Jesus' resurrection and after the crucifixion and all that, because that effectively contradicts, I know he probably wouldn't like to use that word, but I'm going to use it, effectively contradicts Jewish teaching and understandings at the time. Therefore, there's no motivation for that to be, well, he uses the phrase invented. We'll come back to that. There's no motivation for that to be invented or believed by the other disciples. So to me, again, this is just evidence that Christianity isn't true, right? Because it contradicts the source that it's allegedly built on. The more Jeremiah says that it doesn't fit within a first century or sort of traditional understanding of Jewish scripture, the more I'm convinced that it's not, that Christianity isn't actually true, in that it claims to be an extension of Jewish teaching and practice. Why would God do it this way, where it seems like it doesn't fit in, like it seems like it's going this way, but then it actually goes this way, and only by sort of accepting after the fact and looking back can you make any sense of it? Why would God do it that way? Why wouldn't it just be clear at the outset, and then it happens just as you would expect? Again, we are supposed to buy into the fact that this was all designed by an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God who is administering everything and according to his divine plan. What a crappy plan. Like, why would you do it this way? Why not make it clearer? Why not make it unambiguous? Why not have clear prophecies that everyone can verify? Why not have texts that are recorded in ways that can't be corrupted and that can't be questioned about what the source was? Why not have it distributed across more different parts of time and space in, like, China and so forth, and the Americas, and to show that the teachings were distributed in a way that couldn't be explained through other means? Like, there's so many things God could have done and we just don't get any of them. It's just so lame. And again, the more I hear about this trying to rationalize why, in fact, the fact that the Christianity contradicts first century Judaism is evidence for Christianity, I just am more and more convinced that apologetics is a purely rational, like, it's just there to rationalize an existing belief. It's not there to actually, go through the hard yards of trying to think about what would we expect given this postulate that we have about the way that God is supposed to order the world, and what would be reasonable to expect from that, and then how does that compare to what we actually observe, and, like, how do we account for these things? What are the competing explanations? that's just so completely obviously not the exercise that Jeremiah is doing at the very least. Anyway, so we've talked about that. So the fact that it contradicts existing Messiah beliefs is evidence against, not evidence for it. But then let's talk about this idea that, well, they wouldn't have had a motivation to make it up. We've already talked about the idea that no one should postulate that the disciples just sat down in a cabal one day and decided to make all this up. Like, that's ridiculous. That almost certainly never happened. I do think that they tried to rationalize what happened, and then they were drawing on understandings and teachings that were taken from, their understanding of Judaism at the time, and then they would try to incorporate what happened. Like, I think that they were trying to make sense of the fact that Jesus died and then the empty tomb as well, and that they over time developed this understanding, which over years and later morphed into this teaching about the crucifixion and the resurrection, right, and the atonement and all of that. This is something they developed, I think, through a lot of reflection and discussion and probably debates and other things. You don't have to postulate that they just invented it, right? And so the claim here is that there's no psychological motivation for them to do that. But the psychological motivation is obvious. The psychological motivation is that they'd been following a Messiah on the basis of one understanding of what would happen, but then he was killed, which is not what they expected. And so this presents a crisis of faith, which they had to reconcile. And I'm not saying that that coming up with this notion of a resurrection and so forth was the only way that they could have gone. But it's a way that they could have gone, and it was, I think, the way that they did go, right? I don't understand why Jeremiah can claim that there was no motivation. The motivation is clear. It's like cognitive dissonance reduction. They believe this, but then that was shut down, that was cut off because Jesus was killed. They didn't expect that, so they had to make sense of that. How did they make sense of it? Well, I think that they made sense of it by developing this idea about the resurrection. Accompanied by probably, I think, bereavement hallucinations and empty tomb, other factors as well. These are the factors. Like, again, I discussed this in my book, and other people have discussed this as well. There are clear psychological motivators for them to develop some understanding that allows them to preserve their belief and allows them to preserve the idea that they were important, that they weren't mistaken, that they had a role to play, that they were actually part of a unique event in history. Don't tell me that people don't want to believe that they're part of a unique event in history, that they are privy to knowledge that no one else knows, that they're special and chosen, that they have a message that everyone else needs to hear, and that they weren't mistaken, that they were right all along. Maybe they got a few details wrong. They didn't quite understand what Jesus was going to do, but they were still right in, following him and thinking that he was important. These are all factors that we can readily understand and that are well documented in the literature, in like irrational belief persistence, cognitive dissonance, and other factors, right? Resistance to belief revision. That can explain why they developed this, not invented, right, but developed these understandings. For Jeremiah to just sit there and say, oh, he can't see a reason. Well, he obviously hasn't thought about it very hard, has he? Not only that, but we can also see that these same processes that I'm talking about happen in all of the other new religious movements. Like, how does he think that other new religious movements get started? Most of them happen within an existing religious context. Like, for example, Christianity was a coherent religion, to use his phrase. So why did Joseph Smith come and start teaching things like Jesus and God was like separate persons who had physical bodies, and then like polygamy was a thing again, and now there was a new Book of Mormon? Like, why did he start doing that? And more importantly, why did anyone believe him? Like, why did he establish quite a successful following? Took him a while, but eventually the church would actually grow quite rapidly. Why would he do that? And why would anyone believe him when, in the context that he existed, Christianity was already a coherent religion? So according to Jeremiah, that would never happen. Likewise, you could argue about the same thing for Buddha reacting to shouldn't be called Hinduism at the time, but the Brahmanic orthodoxy that he taught against. I mean, heck, even Confucius was in many ways teaching against an orthodoxy, and he was like rejected and had to go to many different cities to try to find employment because most people weren't interested in what he had to say because he was preaching against conventional wisdom. Like, there are so many examples of teachers who have done this, who have gone against the conventional wisdom and reacted against an existing tradition in some ways. Not all of them are successful. Some of them are, right? Why does that make Christianity unique? Just because it emerged in the context of an existing faith tradition? It's just, there's no thought given, or at least there's no evidence of thought given as to why this is actually a factor that makes Christianity more likely, or the resurrection more likely to have happened, just because it emerged in an existing faith tradition, as opposed to all of the other new religious movements that just appeared from thin air. Like, why is that a reason to think that Christianity is true?
They had no psychological motivation. They didn't believe it. They were dejected. They had given up. Christianity was over. Game over with Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion. And yet they could have then carried on and said, hey, Jesus is going to be risen. I cannot make this clear enough And I published in Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbook Philosophy of Religion. This is one of my cases for the resurrection that's now in secular schools in the textbook, I'm delighted to say. But this is the first time I've gone public with this new reason, this fresh argument. And I do think it's something we have to, when you talked about Dale Allison getting into the minds of the disciples, maybe I should think about it going at it the way he argued at it. Because what is the psychological motivation to take the red pill, as it were, and go down this rabbit trail of a physical bodily resurrection if our faith doesn't require it? We could still honor Jesus. We could still follow his teachings. We could still write about him. We could honor him, venerate him in a Jewish tradition thinking. We believe in ghosts, maybe even a ghostly apparition. If, first century Jews believed in ghosts, they have all kinds of phantom stories, etc. We don't need to go to the extent of coming up with this story that Jesus rose from the grave, because we already have an airtight case in coherent Judaism. And so I just don't see a psychological motivation. If I'm going to do what I was taught at Oxford and not privilege the Bible, not privilege the biblical text, I have to ask myself.
Oh, because he's been doing a really good job of that so far, not privileging the biblical text.
Why do they even need a resurrection narrative? They don't need it unless it actually happened.
So the biblical text doesn't tell you anything about the psychological state, not directly about the psychological state of the disciples. Like, it doesn't even tell you anything directly about the psychological state of the people who wrote the New Testament. You maybe can infer some things about that, like that they wanted to convince people to be followers of Jesus, for example, that they held certain theological beliefs. You can infer that. But if then one has to be cautious, of course, because there's many different factors that go into a text, and there's many different motivations that people might have, and so forth. But there's an additional step removed from that to inferring the psychological state of the disciples, and again there's a problem that apologists just never acknowledge. That, I mean, I know this is a shocking concept, but people's psychological state can change over time. So the disciples' psychological state, say at the moment of, like, just let's say the day after the crucifixion, versus a week later, versus a month later, versus 5 years later, that can change, right? So initially they may have been full of doubts and confused. I mean, personally, I don't know that we should believe that, because of the source that we get it from is not, I think, very reliable. But even if we accept that, that doesn't mean that they always stayed that way until they saw a risen Jesus. So the question is, how did their psychological state change, and why did it change? Jeremiah claims to have profound knowledge of what their psychological state was, I guess, across this time. And not only that, but he knows the counterfactuals about what could have caused it to change this way or that way. And he knows that, it's like in what was it, Endgame, where oh bugger, I don't know the characters' names. The sorcerer dude, right? Benedict Cumberbatch. Like he looks into like 50 million different alternate universes and sees that this is the only one that's successful. Like Jeremiah has done that, right? He's Doctor Strange, that's the one. He's looked down all these different timelines and seen that, like, the only one that leads to a belief in Jesus is the one in which there actually is a resurrection, right? Like, this is absurd. Why should we accept this? We need to have an explanation as to, first of all, how do we know what the disciples' psychological states were? And how did they change over time, and what factors were there? And second of all, how do we know what would have happened in the absence of a resurrection versus in the presence of a resurrection versus like other things that could have happened? How do we know what those counterfactuals are? What evidence is there in favor of them? We don't get any of that. All we get is just this bold assertion. Well, they didn't need to, because they could have maybe believed these other things, which are more consistent with existing Judaism. I mean, this is just so absurd. How do we know that they didn't even believe those things? Again, I don't think we do know what the early disciples believed in very much detail, at least if we're talking about all 12 of them. Maybe we know some better than others, arguably. Like Peter is supposedly went to Rome, so I don't know even if that's true, but the point is that, how do we know that some of the disciples didn't believe that Jesus was a ghost, or that other things happened? And maybe they were convinced later, or maybe they were never fully convinced, but their beliefs weren't really recorded because it was against the orthodoxy, or that it was destroyed later. Maybe some of their followers fell away afterwards. We don't know what happened to most of the disciples or other followers of Jesus. Like, there's the 12, and then there's other followers of Jesus who were sometimes also called disciples. We don't know what happened to almost all of them. So for all we know, that they could have believed all sorts of other things and then fallen away. Like, we just have no idea. We don't have that evidence. Of course, Jeremiah thinks that we do. And not only that, but he thinks that he also knows what the counterfactuals would be if this or that other thing would happen. Well, this wouldn't have convinced him, and that wouldn't have convinced him, so it must have been a resurrection. The way that I try to argue for this is I appeal to known and documented processes and phenomena from psychology and sociology, as well as comparative analysis of new religious movements in other contexts, and Messiah claimants and miracle claimants and so forth. Again, this is documented in my book in part. There's other references as well that I don't put in there. But I try to triangulate from a number of sources to work out what plausibly, what sort of factors might have influenced the belief formation and decision-making process of the other disciples. I don't claim to have done a perfect job there. and it's difficult, of course, but I think that I present a plausible case of how they could have arisen out of belief in the resurrection. There's other possibilities as well. I'm not saying it's the only one, but Jeremiah doesn't appear to have any basis for his claims whatever. I mean, maybe it's all in the book, right? But I'm not getting the impression that there's a lot more substance here. If he's trying to give the impression that there's a lot more substance and scholarship to why he's making these claims about what the disciples would have believed and what those forces were, he's not doing a very good job, because I have no impression that there's any substance to this at all, other than just his opinion, which is obviously unbiased and just completely divorced from anything that it says in the Gospels, that it's allegedly independent of. Just his opinion about what the disciples would have believed in different conditions. I just don't know why anyone takes this seriously. It's basically just like someone whose whole job is to convince other people to believe in Jesus, just basically says, trust me, bro, the disciples would never have believed all of this stuff and taught this stuff if it hadn't been for an actual resurrection. And we're just supposed to accept that as an argument. Like, it's just laughable. Like, just try to give us something as to why we should believe this on the basis of, like, something that can be documented as to, like, this is why they would have thought this way. This is the comparison. Like, this is what happens in other religious traditions and so forth. Because it's not like Jesus was the only Messiah claimant in the first century or in subsequent centuries. There are other Messiah claimants as well. Of course, their movements turned out differently in various ways, right? But it's just like, I don't understand why anyone would even bother saying this. It's so insubstantial.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. When you say there's no psychological motivation, typically what people say is, well, they could have a motivation for power. And even though Jesus taught about, giving up power and washing feet, even having some power, like he...
Yes, because it's not like that any followers of Jesus or leaders in the Christian tradition throughout history have ever sought power or abused power in any way, or even in the apologetics community in the 21st century, ironically enough. But, that doesn't happen. So because Jesus taught against it, right? So it doesn't happen. So obviously it can't have been plausible that would have been something motivating Jesus' early followers, because Jesus taught against it, right? And that never happens in the Christian world.
See with the apostles at the beginning of Acts, it's amazing what people do for some level of power. Or you could say something like, well, they had the psychological motivation of being famous. We all think about our posterity. As we're doing this right now, LeBron James is chasing the all-time scoring record. There's a sense of, I'm sure, in his mind that's like, wow, I could be known even when I'm gone as the all-time leading scorer. That's a human motivation. And frankly, it worked. I mean, the world knows the names Peter, Paul, James, and Jesus. So if I understand you, you're saying, given where we are now looking back, we could come up with some psychological motivation. But giving their background, what they believed, and the Judaism that they were a part of, it made no sense to come up with this story versus another story. Is that the heart of the argument you're making?
See what I mean by softball question? So that's what we call a leading question. Sean hasn't just asked a question or presented a criticism. He said, here's what some people might say, but and here's a response. Is that what you're saying? Like that's what I mean by low ball questions. Like this is what's sort of frustrating, right? Because I do like it that Sean does present some questions or objections to an extent, right? But why not just present the objection and let the person you're interviewing respond to it? Why give them a response and ask them, do you agree? Like, that's just so like kind of weak sauce softball. It's just a bit lame in my opinion.
I think you've summarized it very well, Sean, because there would be no psychological motivation, meaning you don't need it. You can honor Jesus in the way that you want to honor him. You don't need to go make up a story that he died and rose again. And, I don't want to even speculate for our modern culture today, but think of just something really offensive, some offensive narrative out there today. It was offensive in the mind of the early Romans to discuss a physically deceased body coming back to life that had begun to rot and ripen in the grave. This was a non-starter for the early Christian movement. And so the motivation, I just don't see it. Judaism, they don't need it. And this is why I think that there really is no substance to what he's saying here. It's not just that, it's in the book somewhere or it's in his papers. It just doesn't exist, because he just doubles down and starts thumping the table. I just don't see it. Like, he's not saying, well, based on these papers or these readings or like this comparison or this case study or these experimental results or this anthropological, he's not saying anything like that and saying, well, see this, or there's this paper here. Like, there's none of that. It's just like, I just don't see it. Like, why would you say that if you actually had literally anything? Like, that's not an actual argument. Like, the fact that Jeremiah can't see it isn't an argument for anything. Even if I couldn't see it, by the way, that wouldn't be an argument for it. It just might mean we haven't thought hard enough about it. The question is it reasonable to think that the disciples had sufficient sort of psychological, sociological factors that influenced them to come to a belief in the resurrection absent, veridical experiences of the resurrection? That is the fundamental question. Jeremiah's answer to that question is, well, he can't see what they would have been, so it's not reasonable to think that they existed.
Now, that's a pathetic argument, regardless of what the topic actually is, that I can't see it, therefore it doesn't exist. Although philosophers do sometimes make arguments like that, but they usually try to at least make it a little bit more rigorous than that. But I mean, not only that, but it's more pathetic because we actually do have evidence about this. We have evidence about other Messiah claims. We have evidence about new religious movements and the psychology and memory distortions and sociology and other factors surrounding those and miracle claims and things, some of which I document in my book, but there's also, other materials as well. I know that Dale Allison talks about a little bit of this in his recent book, which I should get to reading, but I've heard that he discusses this to some extent. So there is evidence that's relevant. And when I think when you look at that, it actually becomes quite reasonable to think that the disciples came to believe these things on the basis of factors that don't require postulating a resurrection. But Jeremiah isn't even addressing any of those. He's just doubling down and saying, but he can't see it, so it must have been a resurrection. Stop asking annoying questions. Okay, it wasn't quite that whiny, but like that's the substance of what I get. Like, just, I can't see it, all right?
We have done a disservice, and we need to do a better job as exegetes, making sure that we guide readers by the hand to read the Bible with first century eyes. We have to read the New Testament with first century eyes. We have to go to the land of Israel. We have to go to the Bible lands. I'll call it plural. So we can really get into the world of the text. So we can understand what motivation would there be for a Jew to make up a story about a rabbi who died and rose again. It's not needed, because we have other stories of rabbis who are very much respected, but they certainly didn't make up a resurrection about them. And there would have been no promise for gain or power with that narrative. They would have had to take that narrative straight to their grave. And that's why we see it actually playing out that way.
Yes, because people like Paul or Peter didn't have any power or influence in the early church. No siree. They didn't have any ability to influence people as they went around and taught, particularly Paul, right, at different Christian communities. And it's not, it's very unreasonable to think that anyone would devote time to, a movement like this where they feel important and get influence. It's not like Reddit monitors are a thing, right? Where they have like no actual power, but they feel like they have this modicum of ability to influence other people's lives in the slightest way by like, banning comments or like moderating a forum that hardly anyone reads. And the point I'm making is that like people will go to extreme efforts, relatively speaking, and viciously or rigorously protect the tiniest, absurdly most limited amount of power that they have. And so to say that Paul and other of the early Christians were not in any way motivated by power or influence, and that just can't have been any factor whatever in the things that they believed or what they did, it's just laughable. Like, what's the psychological evidence for this? What is the basis for saying that can't have been a factor at all, like in early Christian communities or like new religious movements more broadly, that's like not a power? From what we know about new religious communities, power structures are a huge component of this. And power asymmetries. And it doesn't have to be a conscious thing, right? Again, that this idea that either something is like explicitly consciously planned or it's just completely out of like altruistic and non-selfish motives. That's an absurd dichotomy that the evidence doesn't support that. Common sense doesn't support that, right? So I don't know where that comes from. And so the idea that the disciples were just purely altruistically motivated and there was like no selfish motive or no self-serving or self-justifying motives at all, I don't buy. I don't know why you would think that if you were just treating the Gospels and the New Testament like other historical documents, because any other historical document, you would think, oh, what interest are they trying to serve? Are they trying to make themselves look good? Are they trying to paint their opponents in a more negative light than is truly fair? What are the different factors here? Any scholar worth their salt would treat other historical documents in that way and their authors in that way. But somehow that doesn't happen when we're looking at the disciples and Paul and other early Christian teachers. We don't actually give them a nuanced, realistic treatment. We just assume that, or I should say the apologists just assume that everything that they say about themselves and their beliefs is completely true, and they were all entirely altruistically motivated and had absolutely no selfish interests or anything to gain temporally or in terms of reputation or whatever at all. It's just that was no possible factor that could have influenced them. I just don't buy this. And I don't know why anyone would buy this, because it's not how you treat other texts. It's not reasonable based on what we know about how humans work. And there's no evidence whatever given in favor of it. It's just the only reason you would think this is if you already were a Christian and just thought that all of this was true anyway.
As you know, one of the arguments that I've made is the apostles believe they'd seen the risen Jesus and are willing to suffer and die for this.
Yeah, I thought that language was interesting. Take Christians by the hand and tell them how to interpret the Bible. Oof, that sounds a little bit, well, yeah. A little bit non-skeptical. Maybe that's one way to put that.
Your point comes along and at least makes it even stronger that they didn't invent this for lack of psychological reasons, given their Jewish background. Now, we have 3 more reasons you go through in your book, 5, 6, and 7. But before we jump to number 5, and then we'll take some live questions, you're arguing that they had no psychological motivation to do so. But then at the end of the book, you say, well, let's just assume that they did. They did a horrible job inventing this, even if they did make it up. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, who's he responding to? Who says that it was invented? Like in this, what seems to be conscious, deliberate, sort of step-by-step process. Who argues that? I don't know. Maybe there's someone who argues this, but it'd be kind of nice to understand who that is, because like I know that most of the skeptical scholars, like Dale Allison, Barnum, and that they don't argue that, and then that's certainly not what I argue. So I don't know who they're responding to here. And look, even if people do argue that, like, is that the only other possibility? Like, are there not other factors that they're at work here? Like, did we really think that every single other new religious movement was deliberately like planned out and concocted in this sort of deliberate invention way? Because even if there's like one example where that didn't happen, then that raises at least the question as to, well, but didn't these other processes also happen in the Christian case? And I would argue that by far the norm of new religious movements is not for them to be like deliberately invented and concocted in a like, oh, we're going to make up a new religion kind of thing. But they develop out of a set of experiences, and there's a charismatic leader, and then they try to make sense of of what's happening to them and their beliefs, and then they gather a community, and then there's power dynamics and irrational belief persistence, and all of this other stuff, right? I'm hand waving a bit here because I'm trying to summarize briefly, but the point is there's so many cases of this kind of dynamics happening that's really what our starting point should be. In my opinion, for understanding early Christianity, is new religious movements and the sociology and psychology surrounding those, as well as understanding them from a general light, but also taking input from the first century Jewish context as well. It needs to be understood in both those lights. But this isn't what we get here. Like, there's no attempt to do this. It's just like, oh, well, they invented it whole cloth, or it's all true. Like, those are the only two possibilities. And as long as it's all true is more plausible than they invented it whole cloth, then apparently Christianity wins, which is just ridiculous. And by the way, I mean, I don't even think that it is true that the Christianity being true in the like literalistic way that I think Jeremiah and Sean believe. I don't actually think that is even more plausible than inventing it whole cloth. I don't think inventing it whole cloth is very plausible at all. But like Jeremiah says, well, they wouldn't have, if they had invented it whole cloth, they wouldn't have invented this. They would have invented something else. Well, how does he know that? Again, it's these counterfactuals that he somehow knows, like he's peering into these 50 million different futures like Dr. Strange and knows which ones they would like. How do you know what they would or would not have believed? What's the basis for this? Just saying that it's different from what the Orthodox teachings were isn't going to cut it. I mean, aside from anything else, there wasn't even a single Orthodox belief among Jews at the time about the resurrection. It's true that there wasn't very much, if any, belief that the Messiah would be like resurrected as a single event in history, like in the middle of history kind of thing, and he would be killed and then resurrected. Yeah, that wasn't believed. But like, who was it? The Pharisees believed in a resurrection and the Sadducees didn't, or maybe it was the other way around. I always forget. But there was like very lively debate about many of these points. There wasn't like there was one view. And the way that Jeremiah seems to be articulating this is if like, well, Judaism was this like fixed, monolithic, and inflexible set of beliefs that everyone who was a Jew believed, and no straying from that was imaginable or possible. But that just isn't true. That's not how any religion has ever been ever, and it's certainly not how first century Judaism was. And there were many different perspectives and opinions. And within that, within that sort of milieu of different interpretations and beliefs, the disciples that's how they developed their understandings. Of course, then drawing upon their unique experiences and perspectives as Jesus followers. So, even appealing to this context specifically, the first century Jewish context, what Jeremiah is saying makes no sense at all, because it's not like there's one fixed belief that they had to sort of like that they miraculously deviated from, that there was already a diversity of views and opinions there. And we also see this consistent in again, like every other new religious movement ever, that it draws on existing beliefs, but also then changes them and combines them and reimagines them in different ways. And this is like almost a universal a phenomenon in the human tradition about how new religious movements develop. I just don't see any reason for thinking that Christianity is unique here. And Jeremiah doesn't even seem to think to compare Christianity to like literally any other religious movement. At least he doesn't do so in this video.
So I have fun in this book, and this book's really written like if you're a gamer, we start with the easy level, and then it's normal, and then the last couple chapters, it's when you want to take that game and slide over to hard. Because if I had to do a PhD again, the last two chapters of the book, I'd be going in that direction. So I'm hoping, Sean, we can encourage some young scholars out there to check out my argument. I'm hoping they can bring it forward.
And encourage some gamers to check out your book. You're a gamer, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely. My son is cracked on Fortnite, man. So let's go.
Oh, okay. All right, good. Well, hopefully scholars and gamers will check this out. Make your argument. Go.
So in 2012, Society of Biblical Literature, I presented a paper with a room full of scholars and skeptics and seekers. And at Society of Biblical Literature, it's fun because you present the
Scholars, skeptics, and seekers. Interesting way to divide the room up, but anyway.
Paper, and then scholars can react immediately. They can completely disagree, and they can actually strengthen your argument. And I was delighted because Craig Keener, a man that I respect highly.
Can they weaken it, or can they only strengthen it?
For those of you who don't know him, he's a classicist. He's an amazing author, a great scholar, very fair scholar, and he's a true classicist. He said, Jeremiah, you were onto something with this argument. I presented the early version.
So this seems to be more chest pumping, like, oh, look, this smart classicist, we told he was a classicist like twice in 10 seconds, said that Jeremiah was onto something. So it must be good, guys, because we got yet another scholarly endorsement.
And many versions ago of what is in the popular version now in my book, Body of Proof. And I just made several points that the gospel writers, again, if they want to have a theological or psychological motivation, hey, we should, Sean, let's get together and come up with something. Let's write something very compelling, and let's really make this up in a way that it is going to impact lots of people. We see so much embarrassing narrative. And this is what I would come back to Dale Allison with. I keep thinking about that first question you asked me. The gospel writers do not hide the embarrassing narrative that we read in the gospels. And they don't do that because the stories are true. And my whole crux of that chapter at the end of my book, if the gospel writers invented the resurrection story, they did a terrible job. And why can I say that? Did I just come up with that? So my area of specialty is I'm a specialist in extra-canonical gospels, second century extra-canonical gospels. I don't say apocryphal because in England that's thought to be being pejorative or privileging the biblical text. So extra-canonical gospels, these are gospels like writings, with about 70 of which that didn't make it into the New Testament canon. My primary text is what came to be known as the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is written in the late 2nd century. And it seems to be responding to the very same criticisms that we're talking about in the show. We have early objectors like Celsus and Porphyry. These would be 2nd and 3rd century objectors who ridicule. They attack the Christian faith for its lowbrow attempt to convince us that Jesus was resurrected. They didn't even see the actual event. In fact, we only know about the resurrection because of female witnesses. Why didn't he appear to the Roman governor? Why didn't he appear to the elite of his day? And you're going to read this if you learn about.
Still a good objection, by the way. It would have been much more convincing if the Roman Senate had seen a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, and we had an early attestation to that. Much more convincing than him appearing to his family and a small group of followers. But anyway, let's continue.
Body of Proof. And truly, in 3 hours of reading my book, you're going to know more than 90% of people about the current state of resurrection research. I want to really encourage you to read it. It's right up.
Shockingly, he's encouraging us to read his book. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just... get very strong self-promotion vibes from this video.
At the heart of my life and our ministry.
I mean, I spruik my book as well, I suppose, but
when we see these arguments that they're making, they don't make sense, and that's why they did a terrible job if they're trying to invent the narrative. But they didn't invent it; they shared it was true, and that's why we see this sober narrative. They're almost holding back.
Wait, so the fact that the New Testament, that the Gospels are actually really weak evidence is evidence for them, because if they were making it up, they would have made up better evidence. It's just like, it doesn't matter what it says in the Gospels. Whatever they happen to say, this will be spun as evidence for it. If the evidence is strong, then it's strong evidence. If it's weak, well, then that's still evidence for it, because if the fact that it's weak is evidence that they didn't make it up, because if they made it up, they would have made it up to be stronger. It's heads I win, tails you lose. Like, how is this a serious argument? Like, what I think is interesting is that Jeremiah started by saying that there's many embarrassing details in the in the Gospels, in the canonical Gospels. And then he said that his expertise is extra-canonical Gospels, which is actually interesting. I'm quite interested in extra-canonical Gospels. Not that I know too much about them, but I think they make an interesting sort of point of comparison, because Christians, mainstream Christians, will not recognize them as being legitimate. So, but many of them are still quite early. There's a few that might be 1st century, like the Gospel of Thomas might be, but then there's like a bunch from the 2nd century and so forth. So that's still quite early in the scheme of things. So the sort of question is, well, what texts were being written and obviously preserved sufficiently such that we have any extant copies of them? So they were obviously circulating, like people were reading them, otherwise we wouldn't have them, right? What sort of texts were being written and circulated in early Christian communities? And what sort of things did they say? That tells you about those communities, right? Somehow scholars don't, I shouldn't say scholars, somehow apologists don't seem to, they seem to think that like the 1st and 2nd century Christian communities were just, everyone knew what the correct theology was and orthodoxy, and there was very little dissension or whatever. And then only later did all the like heresies develop, because, orthodoxy was just like firmly nailed down from like the disciples onwards. It's not like that there was widespread disagreement and grasping at different ideas, which I think is more like what happened from what I've read. But anyway, sort of the point is that these extra-canonical gospels tell us a lot about what people actually believed and were teaching and thinking about in those first couple of centuries. Now, the question here is then, if the canonical gospels contain many embarrassing details, and that is evidence in favor of them being veridical or like truthful, let's compare that to how many embarrassing details are contained in non-canonical gospels and see if there's a higher rate of embarrassing details. Of course, I don't know how you'd establish something as embarrassing in an objective way, but let's suppose you had some criteria there. Well, you apply that for the canonical and the non-canonical, and you see, is there a higher rate of embarrassing details in the canonical compared to the non-canonical? This is actually a pretty good way, I think, of testing whether they're like at least this basic point is true. But the thing is, Jeremiah doesn't actually say that. He just says that there's what he actually is saying and continues in saying is that the non-canonical gospels include responses to arguments that were being made by like Christian critics at the time, critics of Christianity at the time, which is true that they do. Of course, the canonical gospels do as well. One of the clearest examples of this is the guard at the tomb, which is overwhelmingly agreed and is sort of very clearly an apologetic insert. I think you can also read the genealogies in, like Matthew and Luke, I think, have the genealogies. I think those also clearly serve an apologetic exercise as establishing Jesus as like Jewish credentials as Messiah. There's others as well. So like the point is, it's clear that there are apologetic inserts that are responding to other details. In fact, Craig even argues this, right? That's an argument that he gives in favor of the historicity of the guard by saying specifically that it is an apologetic insert in response to early arguments. So the point is, okay, sure, later non-canonical gospels had inserts that were apologetic responses to people who were saying them at the time. Somehow that's an argument against their historicity. I'm not really sure why that's an argument against. I mean, why couldn't something that's historical also have like counter-apologetic insertions? Although I suppose you might ask, well, yeah, but then can we trust what they're saying if they're clearly biased? Well, we knew they're biased anyway. So anyway, because they say they're biased, like they say what the purpose is, and it's to convince people. But then the point is, if the inclusion of counter-apologetic insertions in non-canonical gospels is evidence against their historicity, does not the inclusion of apologetic insertions in the canonical gospels count against their legitimacy? Maybe there's a greater number of them in the non-canonicals, I suppose one could argue, but at least it sort of complicates that point there. But Jeremiah doesn't really seem to draw that out. He just sort of says, well, there's stuff in the non-canonicals which is like suspect for some unclear reason, and then doesn't really draw a clear comparison there. But also, we've kind of left the point, because the initial point wasn't whether there's counter-apologetic insertions. The question is there embarrassing details that seem to have been unlikely to have been invented? And as I said, he doesn't actually do that comparison. He doesn't compare the number of embarrassing details in the canonical compared to the non-canonical. In which case, well, how can we assess that there's more embarrassing details than would be expected? Because you haven't compared it to non-canonical gospels. So, like, where does the comparison even come from?
Points, almost stunned themselves as they're reporting the events. I could see them looking back at the gospel writers saying, I can't believe I didn't see it. I didn't see it there. How could I have been so wrong? I mean, we've all been there in other experiences in our life. We didn't realize what a big deal it was at the time that we were having that moment. I could see that in the life of the disciples. And so I point this out in the chapter, and I give you specific details that are embarrassing, that just leave you wondering and scratching your head, why would you include that if you're trying to pull one over on us and invent a narrative? And so
and by the way, of course, this all assumes that all of these details were invented in order to pull one over on us, which again is not what most skeptics think, and I don't think it's what skeptics should argue, because I don't think it's that plausible. So he's arguing at the best against a weak man, like a weak version of the argument, and maybe a straw man, depends on how many people you can find who actually argue this. So I just don't see the relevance here. Again, I think this is just for the benefit of Christians who don't want to think about this too carefully, and in their mind, it's either it was all a deliberate invented hoax, or it's all true. And as long as we can convince ourselves that it's not likely to have been a deliberate invented hoax, then it must be all true. Like that's the only relevance I can think of for including this. Because of course, if you don't think it was invented, then the embarrassing details can be explained by, well, that's what they believed happened, right? And so that they're genuinely including it. Of course, there are other explanations as well. For example, I believe that one factor motivating the inclusion of female witnesses to the empty tomb, I think that may have been historical, but I also think that a factor motivating that is to explain potentially, I should rephrase this. I think that one potential explanation, not necessarily the true, what actually happened, one potential explanation for why that's presented as being told by women is to explain why no one had heard of it before. This is what I've argued this in previous videos, right? Because in at least some of the Gospels, I don't know if it says this in all of them, but in some of them, it specifically says like the women were told not to tell anyone. And then like the earliest version of Mark ends with the women saw the empty tomb and then they were afraid and ran away and didn't tell anyone. That seems to be explaining why no one had heard of this before, because, oh, well, there's a bunch of scared women who like didn't tell anyone because they wouldn't have been believed anyway. Like, at least that's an explanation for why it would be included there, right? It's embarrassing. And so precisely because of that fact explains why no one had heard about it before. Now, I'm not saying that that's what happened. I think the empty tomb probably was historical, right? But the point is that there are other explanations you can come up with as to why embarrassing details may have been in there, whether they were truly embarrassing, whether that's what was inserted for other apologetic reasons, or that's just what people believe actually happened. So they are reporting it faithfully, but they're still mistaken about other things. All it really counts against is this sort of deliberate manufacturing, which I don't think we should believe anyway. So it's just not really relevant as an argument. And again, as I mentioned before, we also haven't established the baseline of embarrassing details between the canonical Gospels and the things that we know were written. This is interesting because Jeremiah doesn't explain what he thinks the status of non-canonical Gospels is. Does he believe that the authors of non-canonical Gospels were all deliberate frauds who manufactured these writings in order to maliciously convince people of things that they knew to be false? I think that may have been the case in some instances, but I think in other cases, people thought that they were writing genuine depictions of what happened from their own points of view and gathering from traditions that they'd heard. I don't actually see the reason for assuming that it was entirely malicious, at least in all of these extra-canonical Gospels. And so the thing is that if you find embarrassing details in non-canonical Gospels, like, what does that tell you? Like, does that tell you that, it seems to me that Jeremiah should interpret that as evidence that actually, so if Jeremiah thinks that non-canonical Gospels are just maliciously concocted to deliberately deceive, then he should really question then how they could include embarrassing details, if they include any, which, I mean, it seems that they do, right? Like he mentioned some from Peter, all these very, very odd, strange things that they include. Like, why did they include this? Well, if they were just concocted to deceive, then why would they include things that are like embarrassing or weird, right? But on the other hand, if they're not deliberately concocted to deceive, then how did they get written in the first place? How does he explain them? And then it comes back to the same question, like, what's the motivation for people to write these non-canonical Gospels? And that casts doubt on his idea that it must have been a deliberate concoction on behalf of the canonical Gospels, right? Because he's established this dichotomy of deliberate concoction or completely like accurate and genuine and historically reliable. But that just seems to break down in the case of the non-canonical Gospels. Like, do we really think that they were all maliciously written? And does their content make sense in light of that hypothesis? I mean, he's supposed to be an expert in this, right? So it'd actually be interesting how he explains the origin of the non-canonical Gospels and everything that they say in them. And how does it, and everything that he says to explain why the non-canonical Gospels exist and why they include the things that they do, could those processes not also be used to explain the content of the canonical Gospels and what is included in those? Because I'm going to assume he's going to say that the non-canonical Gospels are not divinely inspired and in many respects are not historically accurate. And so whatever process he gives us to explain how they came to be, could we not appeal to a similar process or processes to explain the canonical Gospels? That's kind of what I'm interested in, right? I don't have the knowledge to do that specifically. I think it's an interesting area, and I don't really think it's explored here. It just sort of puts them to the side as if they're like they don't need to be treated in the same way as the canonical Gospels. But of course, if we're actually to follow through on what Jeremiah said earlier, we should treat the canonical Gospels just the same as the non-canonicals, just the same as extra. As like non-Christian writings. We should treat them all the same on the basis of their own merits and internal logic and the background that we have for it and like where the text came from and authentication and things like that. We should treat them on that basis and not on the basis of whether they're in the New Testament or not. But it doesn't seem like we actually get that treatment here.
That seems to be a helpful way for Christians to specifically look at the Gospels. Our good friend, Gary Habermas, has done such a wonderful job the last 30 years, bringing Paul into the forefront as a great source for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm hoping that this book, in a small way, will simply bring the Gospels back to the centrality of that discussion as well with Paul, saying, hey, let's not forget the Gospels are also great sources, and here's why.
It's really interesting when you get 2nd, 3rd century Celsus and Porphyry saying things like, why does Jesus look so weak in the garden?
Yep.
Why are you holding up somebody who was crucified and making him a savior?
Trash, Sean. I mean,
they totally do. But they don't.
And I give the quotes in the book.
And you're right. And it's not just.
I don't know why this is surprising. I mean, I don't know.
talking trash. It's as if the gospel writers enabled them to do so. Like they're pointing out, why can't you guys get together here correctly which women were even at the tomb? So
Right.
your point in general is if they're making this up, they're obviously smart. We've got to at least concede that to them. It's just going to look differently. And I think
And
that's a
can I
good
add
point.
Yeah, so then how do you explain the extra-canonical gospels, right? Which have all sorts of other details and inconsistencies or differences with the canonical gospels. Like, are these not made up? Because if they're not made up and like concocted wholesale to convince people, then what processes led to them being developed? And then why can't you appeal to those same processes for the development of the canonical gospels? The point is the non-canonicals just seem to break their dichotomy, because if they're maliciously made up, then why do they contain all of the things that they do? And why aren't they more consistent and so forth? That doesn't seem to work. It undercuts this argument. But then if they aren't maliciously concocted and it's a more complex, nuanced story, which I think almost certainly it is, then why can't we apply that same story to the canonical gospels and explain their development without needing to appeal to malicious concoction? I don't see that they make an effort to explain the non-canonical gospels and treat them in a fair way in comparison to the canonicals.
Footnote that I forgot, Sean, because I keep thinking about your great question. So in bringing up, why did I bring up second century and my expertise there? The Gospel of Peter seems to fill those gaps apologetically. In the Gospel of Peter, which is not historical, it's not written by the Gospel of Peter, something like early Christian comic books. Jesus is gigantic when he comes out of the cross. Who does he appear to? He appears to Pilate. And by the way, and I've been very concerned. I was reading some work this morning, Sean, about the rise of anti-Semitism.
So why does why does the second century Gospel of Peter include a giant Jesus coming out of the tomb, or was it off the cross? Whichever one it is. When the earlier Gospels don't say that. Like, if you were concocting this, wouldn't you want to make your story more consistent? Like, I don't know all of the, like, very much about the specifics of it, but like, I know there are issues like this where it's not just a harmonization; it adds things and changes things, right? So, like, you've got the same question there. Jeremiah's just said it's not historical, so then why does it include details that contradict earlier Gospels that would have been presumably accepted at the time? If someone is concocting the Gospel of Peter in order to convince people of something that they know is false, why include details like this, which seem outrageous and kind of silly, but also, and so I would say that's kind of embarrassing, like a giant Jesus, like, well, this is weird, like, why are you saying this? But also are different to what the other Gospels say. So why include those details? Like, you've got the same problem there for extra-canonical Gospels. It's just in this case, you can't appeal to their historicity to resolve those issues. So how do you resolve them? And my question would be, well, how have you resolved them? Why can't we resolve the same questions in the canonical Gospels in the same way? And likewise, sure, the Gospels of Peter and other extra-canonical Gospels include counter-apologetic inclusions, but so do the canonicals. I just mentioned I think that a very clear example of this is the guards of the tomb in Matthew, but also the genealogies to establish Jesus's descent from David. The two genealogies, which are different, by the way. Also, there's not another point that we should make is that it's not like we don't have to assume that the early gospel authors were planning with each other. Like, obviously we know that Luke and Matthew were familiar with Mark because they plagiarized like a whole chunk of it. But that doesn't mean they agree with Mark on everything, right? It doesn't mean that they are like in a room planning what heist they're going to pull over on the Christian community about what they should include. So they can disagree with each other, right? And they can have different sources that they're drawing from, or different theological positions that they're trying to emphasize, and so forth. And that's why we can see different. Like, that's an explanation for why they include differences. You don't have to appeal to the fact that. Well, I'm not actually sure how he explains the differences, right? He kind of didn't explain them. All he was saying is that differences are evidence against deliberate collusion. But the thing is that each individual author could still have been trying to pull one over on us, right? I don't think that they were in that sort of simplistic way, but each individual author could have still been trying to do that. It's just that they weren't all working together. Like, at least that can explain the inconsistency. So the argument doesn't even work on its own terms. Like, just because there's differences between them doesn't mean that each individual author couldn't have been trying to maliciously convince us. And I don't know why the inclusion of counter-apologetic insertions is somehow evidence against there being like a malicious, or sorry, the lack of insertion of them is evidence that they weren't trying to pull one over on us. I just don't understand why that's an argument.
I don't know if you've read some of this right
Sure.
now going on in our culture. It's disgusting. There was so much anti-Semitism in the 2nd century, and we even see that reflected in the Gospel of Peter, who absolves the Romans of any kind of fault in the death of Jesus. They lay the blame completely at the Jewish feet. Jesus appears. We even have the name of the Roman centurion. Of course, the Gospels didn't give it, so Gospel Peter's going to give it. His name is Petronius. And so we see this, what you might call gap-filling narrative. Haven't you ever read the Gospels? I'm talking about now the canonical Gospels. You're like, man, I wish I could have more. I mean, you can read the...
This is so stupid because later Gospels fill in gaps left by Mark. Like Matthew and Luke include many more details than aren't present in Mark, such as the birth narratives being an example of that. And then John fills in other details not included in the earlier Gospels. And then later extra-canonical Gospels fill in more details. So it's like somehow the details filled in by the 4 canonical Gospels are okay, but details filled in by later ones are not okay. Like what is the criteria here between a gap that it's okay to fill and is evidence of a legitimate like historical text, and a gap that it's not okay to fill, which is evidence of people making things up after the fact? It's just completely ad hoc. There's no standard here for what is evidence of being historical and what is evidence for being non-historical.
The Sermon on the Mount in a few minutes, and this would have been a sugar stick sermon that Jesus gave many times, not just once. But don't you want to know more about it? I think that's why we're captured by the Chosen broadcast right now from my buddy Dallas. But when we open the Gospel of Peter, we see that the Gospel of Peter, and I'll give you another one, the Acts of Pilate, seem to be answering these early objections from Celsus and Porphyry and other early thinkers. They weren't the only ones who were saying, well, why didn't you invent a narrative, or why didn't you have Jesus before the high priest in his resurrection state? And the very fact that we have something called polymorphic Christology, that means we have a giant Jesus. The angels come out and meet him. He's gigantic. And then, as Dom Crossan pointed out in his book, The Talking Cross, which I don't recommend, even the cross speaks and answers the voice of God. So, so that's why I brought up the 2nd century is, wow.
Does he think that's an embarrassing detail? Because we could ask, like, well, why does it include that? If it's like kind of because I know that I don't know about Celsus specifically, but I know some of the early like pagan critics of Christianity criticize it as being essentially like superstitious and old wives' tales and unbelievable stories and things like this, right? And a talking giant cross seems to fit into that as well. So, like, I don't know why. I mean, maybe not everyone would find that embarrassing in the 1st century context, but it seems like that you could argue criteria of embarrassment. Like, well, why would they say this absurd thing that you would expect a giant talking cross? Like, come on, someone else would have written that down. Like, then that's kind of ridiculous. Like, why would that happen? Criteria of embarrassment. Well, it must have happened, right? Because why would they make up something so silly? I'm sure you can argue against that. Like, oh, it wouldn't have been embarrassing because this, but this is the problem, that the criteria are just so subjective, and it seems that they're applied differently to the canonical versus the non-canonical. When there's apologetic insertions in the canonical, it's okay. But when there are apologetic insertions in the non-canonical, for some reason, that's evidence against their historicity. When there's weird, embarrassing stuff in the non-canonicals, we like laugh about that. But then when there's weird, embarrassing stuff or just bizarre things like the zombie walk in Matthew, for example, then like, oh, that's okay. We don't have to worry about that. Like, that's not evidence against historicity. I just don't see any consistent standards being applied. And I don't see evidence of what Jeremiah has said, that he treats the canonical Gospels just on par with other ancient texts. I mean, maybe he does so in some of his scholarly work, but he doesn't seem to be doing so here.
Oh, have you ever read any of these documents? Why aren't the Gospels included in the canon? Well, have you read them? You know, if you read them, you'll probably start answering your own questions. So I wanted to close the loop. Thanks for giving me the opportunity there.
Super helpful. Yeah, love it. Let's shift to your last 3. And maybe we'll not Twitter. We don't have to be quite that fast, but we'll give your basic argument here. So to make sure we can get plenty of time for questions. I see some great comments and questions, people weighing in here. I didn't realize the first time you'd gone public making that argument. So I'm back and check out Dr. J's scholarly. We'll do something like that.
I would love that.
Awesome. Let's shift to number 5. You say written and archaeological sources overwhelmingly, that's a pretty strong word, support the Gospel's resurrection narratives.
The juridical procedure that we see playing out in the Gospels is exactly what we find in Jewish burial traditions of the time. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. Jody Magnus, an atheist archaeologist from the University of North Carolina, who I footnote in the book, and others, so she has no theological motivation to say this, says, yes, the Gospels get it right. And so when you study the archaeology of burial traditions in Judaism, we see that everything that we read in the Gospels smacks of authenticity. So that's point number 5. I highly recommend that one, because you need to know something about Jewish burial traditions, because you're going to hear other thinkers like Bart Ehrman, Sean, who claim that Jesus' body was likely buried in a criminal's tomb, if buried at all, and it could have been even eaten by wild animals. John Dominic Crossan claimed that Jesus' body wasn't buried, it was eaten by dogs. And this flies in the face of what we understand from Jewish burial traditions at the time in a non-war scenario in the time of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. So I give the reader a lot of helpful citations and just walk you through. Again, I want to introduce you to the real Jesus, the Jesus of the...
Yeah, so this, again, this confirms what I was thinking before, that some of his earlier arguments about like, this is what the disciples would have believed, or this is what they wouldn't have believed, it would have taken a resurrection to convince them, like those sort of psychological claims that he made. This reaffirms that that's just based on nothing but his speculations, because here he's talking about, he mentions someone he cited, he mentions a few scholars by name, he talks about citations and work that he's done. He's actually giving some of the evidence for what he's saying. So I'm assuming that when he doesn't do that at all, makes no effort to do that, he actually doesn't have anything. So I just think that's interesting, right? I mean, I guess that's an argument from silence, but I don't know. I find that convincing. I guess ultimately I'd have to read his book, but it's just interesting to note the difference here. Now, I don't actually understand how this is like a broken record here. I don't understand how this is an argument for the resurrection. Okay, so we've been told that John Dominic Crossan and what was the other person you mentioned? Bart Ehrman have incorrect beliefs about Jewish burial tradition in the first century. I don't know if that's true. I don't really trust what Jeremiah is saying here, and it isn't quite consistent with what I've read elsewhere, which is that there was quite a lot of variation in burial tradition, like following a crucifixion in particular, and that different things could be done in different contexts. But whatever. That doesn't even really matter. We can just take Jeremiah on his word here that the Gospels get it right when they say that this is how crucifixion victims, Jewish crucifixion victims, would have been buried, like in a tomb. Let's just take that for granted that Jeremiah is correct about that, and that John Dominic Crossan and Bart Ehrman are wrong about when they say that Jesus would have been eaten by dogs or whatever. What follows from that about the resurrection specifically? What follows from that? Like, Jeremiah doesn't even say what follows from that. He doesn't even really imply what follows from that. Apparently, a resurrection is supposed to follow from that, but I'm not quite sure. Like, okay, so someone was buried in this particular way, and that the way it describes it in the Gospels is probably how it would have happened. Okay, yeah, okay, someone was buried, and it was following these sorts of customs. Okay, yeah. Also, they must have been raised from the dead. Well, hang on, how did that? Okay, so these documents say that he was buried in a certain way, which probably happened. Therefore, and they also say that he raised from the dead. So when I see the depiction of the burial is accurate, I should also believe the depiction of the resurrection is accurate. Okay, so this is the Harry Potter argument for the resurrection, right? When I read in Harry Potter about how he went to platform 9 3/4 of King's Cross Station, and it talks about how he had his like trolley of stuff, and he goes on the platform and so on. All of which are, well, okay, 9 3/4 isn't real, but platforms 9 and 10 are, and there's a real King's Cross Station, and we know that the context of how trains work and train stations and timetables and all this stuff, that actually fits from the context of a late 20th century Britain and all of this stuff. And so we should therefore accept that Harry Potter actually did go to a magical school of witchcraft and wizardry and learn all these spells and wand work and so forth. Like, this is just mind-numbingly idiotic, right? That because certain mundane or relatively mundane details are accurately depicted in a text, that therefore supernatural, miraculous, or very not mundane events that are also described in those texts also must have happened as they're described in the text. Like, what person thinks this? I mean, in Lord of the Rings, it talks about fields, and it talks about mining, and it talks about weaponry and battles and horse riding and things that, those are all part of the real world, and they work like kind of the way it says. So therefore, we should think that Sauron really forged the One Ring. Like, what kind of argument is this? Just because it says accurately about something in a text doesn't mean that everything else in the text is correct, which is like just such an obvious point. Like, why should we think that because it accurately describes a burial, just taking what he said about that for face value, that it does accurately describe how burials would have happened after a first century Jewish crucifixion, that therefore what it says about the resurrection must also be correct? How could anyone think that that's a good argument? I do not understand. It's just such an absurd thing to say.
The first century, the Jesus who lived and ministered in Judea and Galilee. That's the Jesus that I'm trying to introduce you to as a historian.
Yeah, I mean, this is literally the argument. The Bible is not wrong in this specific point. Therefore, when it says this person is God, well, must be true, right? It's just like,
Number 6. You want me to move on to the other?
Yeah, hold on. So let me ask you one of the things.
And that was it. And that was it. Like that literally is the point. He said the burial tradition is accurately recorded. Therefore, that's reason to think that their resurrection is historical. Unbelievable. He didn't even try to explain what the connection is between those, as if no explanation is needed. If the Bible's right about one thing, well, come on. Like, it's not like a book that's right about one thing could be wrong about something else. Like, that's silly. Come on. We all know that either books are completely correct in everything that they say or completely wrong in everything that they say. So if it's right in one thing, it must be right in everything else. That is how a mature person thinks about treating books. And by the way, this is also how we treat all historical sources. If they get one thing right, then everything that they say must be correct. So he's not treating the Bible in any differently than any other historical text. Whenever a historical text says one thing that's correct, everything else in it must be correct. Whenever it says that something happened, we just believe that thing happened, right? Whenever the author says, makes a claim about themselves or their sources, well, we just believe that because that's what they said, right? You know, this is how a responsible person looks at historical documents.
Go into is the Garden Tomb versus the Holy Sepulchre. Now, I've been to the Garden Tomb.
I didn't care about this. Let's skip that point.
The burial crypt of Jesus. People just come in, and then this was put on display. I put this so good. That's likely the spot of Jesus. There's some great archaeology. I did this last today, outside of Easter Sunday and funeral services. But when I looked, I found scholarly treatment. Our issue in Christianity that because
defense of the resurrection,
we will be raised also.
I love that. That's one of the things we do at Biola. I teach a semester class on the defense of the resurrection.
Yeah.
In fact, sometime we'll bring you in to talk about that. So there's need for it. And I appreciate that you're a scholar that makes stuff practical. That's why I think you and I have so much in common. We both try to do that. I do have one more somewhat quick question, if it's possible. But the chapter on archaeology, in some ways, fictional stories can be built upon real archaeological
events.
Is
my objection.
Like the Avengers took place, and there's real places like New
So again, Sean is raising a good objection. Let's see how this goes.
York, so to speak. So is this a reason that it's true? Or do you say this is just corroborative support?
Oh, we started off good. You see what I was saying here? He does the lowball thing, right? This is a leading question because he says, here's the objection. And then he suggests a response so that his guest doesn't actually have to answer the question. They can just say, oh, yeah. I agree with what you're saying there. It's not a real objection. It's not actually presenting him like anything difficult. It's just, why does he do this? Why doesn't he just say, okay, here's the objection, or here's the possible counter. What do you say about this? Why does he have to build in a response that then his the person he's interviewing can just spit back to him or agree with him? Like it's so lame and like just lowballing things. I just don't know why he does this. I think it's really bad practice.
That the biblical writers got it correct and aren't making this up centuries removed. What exactly does the archaeology show?
We already know that the gospel authors aren't making it up centuries removed because the gospels were written decades afterwards. I mean, I still think that decades is enough to be concerned, but it's not like the New Testament. Sorry, it's not like that the burial practice has changed that much in the times between when the gospels were written and when the events happened. So the fact that they knew enough about that to get that correct, even if they were making it up whole cloth, it's just really not that surprising. It's not unexpected that they would be able to get those details correct, or at least approximately correct. And so I don't know how it distinguishes between the two hypotheses of making it up versus not making it up. Is it expected that they would be able to know this if they were making it up? Well, maybe not if they were writing 500 years later, but we know they weren't writing 500 years later. No one says that they were writing 500 years later or 300 years later, like centuries removed. So who is Sean responding to here? Like, who makes this objection that, well, actually the burial narratives were made up centuries later? Like, no one says that. So it's irrelevant.
In your estimation?
Two things. Well, the archaeology shows that the gospel resurrection narratives, so the death and resurrection narratives, which hear me clearly, which are embedded in the gospels, they get it right. We already see.
What archaeological evidence is there in favor of the resurrection, Jeremiah? Could you give me one citation of the archaeological evidence that specifically supports that Jesus was raised from the dead in the way that you understand it as a resurrection? So Jeremiah provided us with some references for archaeological evidence about burial customs, which would support the accuracy of the burial traditions reported in the Gospels. But now he's talking about the resurrection tradition. So what is some archaeological evidence in favor of the resurrection traditions? By the way, certain places or people who are referred to in text in these texts that talk about the resurrection, that doesn't count as archaeological evidence in favor of the resurrection. That just counts. That's just what Sean was saying, that some of the places and people that are referred to really existed. Well, yes, I mean, again, no one disagrees with that. The question is, what archaeological evidence specifically supports the contention or the claim that Jesus bodily rose from the dead? Because I've never heard anything. I mean, it's not even clear what that would look like, right? The absence of his bones. I mean, the whole point is that his bones were raised, so like he doesn't have those. It's not an event that anyone witnessed. So, I mean, what archaeological evidence, even in principle, maybe the Shroud of Turin, or I think they talk about that later, actually, but I don't want to get into that here. Like, what even in principle could count as archaeological evidence in favor of the resurrection in any direct way? There could be archaeological evidence in favor, perhaps, of people believing in the resurrection, but that's a different thing. I don't know what he's talking about here. He doesn't explain. He doesn't show what the connection is between archaeological evidence, say, that the burial narratives are accurate, and archaeological evidence in favor of the resurrection narratives being accurate.
See how the extra-canonical gospels get it wrong. It flies in the face. Other thinkers like Peter J. Williams have pointed out, they even get the names wrong. They get the rivers wrong. That's the true. Gospel, juridical procedure, the death, execution, and resurrection of Jesus, they get it right. And here's the second point to your point. If it is true, there should be archaeological fallout for it. And there is.
All right, well,
it's a shame that he doesn't actually explain what any of that archaeological fallout is. If he's talking about the resurrection, if he's talking about the burial, well, yeah, we got some references there, but the burial really is separate from the resurrection. Like, kind of everyone thinks that Jesus died and at least something happened to his body. Not everyone agrees that he was buried, in a tomb, but everyone thinks that something happened to his body. So, I mean, that is not really that interesting. What's interesting is, was he resurrected? That's where the disagreement lies, and that's what Jeremiah is supposed to be trying to establish here. And yet he says that there's archaeological evidence for it, but he doesn't actually say what that looks like or give any examples. The only things we get are for the burial, which really doesn't have anything to do with it. And in response to Sean's objection that, well, yeah, but couldn't it be made up and still have some details that are correct? He basically just doesn't answer the question. He says, well, there are texts written much later that get some things wrong. Well, yeah, but the fact that some texts get things wrong, which are so there are some texts that are ahistorical and get things wrong. Does it follow that if something gets a text gets detail right, that therefore everything it says is historical? Obviously, it doesn't follow. So what relevance is this? Like, it's so obvious, at least to me, that these arguments are just completely flimsy. Like, that it's not just that I disagree with this or that interpretation of evidence. It's just that the structure of the argument is fundamentally flawed, at least in the way it's being articulated here. There's just no reason to draw a connection between accurate depiction of burial narratives and accurate depiction of resurrection narratives. He doesn't even try to explain why we should draw that connection, other than saying, yeah, but there's some other gospels that didn't get this thing right. Well, so what? I mean, what does that have to do with anything? That there's some books that are set in World War II that get things accurate to World War II, and there are some that don't. That doesn't tell us anything about what actually happened in World War II. It just means that, like, some books that are set there are correct and some aren't. Like, but how do you know which is which and what the criteria appealing to? We don't get that.
So let's move to 6 and 7, and then we will have time for live questions from believers and skeptics. Number 6, you say, only Jesus' resurrection convincingly explains the conversion of people, not previously his followers.
I don't think we appreciate that Paul was an ardent Pharisee. And again, he went by Paul and Saul. It was the context. He didn't become Paul. He was Paul the whole time to his Latin audience. He was Saul the whole time of his life to his Hebrew audience. So Paul was a chauvinist. The fact that I go into depth, his experience in Damascus and how that transformed his worldview from a chauvinist Pharisee to then eventually writing something like Galatians 3:28, we're all one in Jesus Christ, slave, we're not slave, we're free, we're not male nor female, we're all one in Jesus Christ. The fact that someone who had the upbringing, the educational pedigree that Paul did is astounding. And he was truly hostile to Christianity. We have hostile witnesses coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and we have this occurring in the first century. And so that's compelling to me. It's my point number 6 when we look at the hostile witnesses who come to faith in Jesus Christ. And the only reason Paul comes to faith in Jesus Christ is because he has an experience of seeing the resurrected Jesus, and that utterly transforms his worldview. And I feel like we gloss over that pretty quickly in chapter 6, especially with Paul. I go into it in depth. Gary Habermas has done a phenomenal job talking about James. What would it take for you to bring, Gary always says, to believe that your brother.
So we're moving from Paul to James. Okay, so the appearance of Paul. Now, the appearance of Paul is interesting because it's by far, in my view, the best attested of any of the appearances, because Paul, so the detailed account given in Acts is not actually written by Paul, but Paul does mention, I think, hearing the voice of Jesus, at least if I remember correctly. I don't think he actually talks about the appearance in any detail in his own writings. I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong there. But anyway, the point is, at least we have an identifiable source, and it's someone talking about something that happened to them. And it's sooner after the event than the Gospels were. So it's sort of better than any of the evidence we have for the Gospels. Now, the thing about Paul, despite what the apologists would have you think, Paul never met Jesus. Paul did not know what Jesus looked like. Paul never spoke to Jesus. Paul was not one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Paul never heard Jesus speak. Okay, Paul is not a resurrection appearance. Like Paul does not count as a resurrection appearance. Remember the whole point of Pentecost when Jesus is taken up after like 50 days or whatever it is following the resurrection. Well, Paul's conversion was after that. So what's happening here exactly? Like the point I'm making is Paul didn't know Jesus, so it's sort of unclear how he could even know who Jesus was if Jesus appeared to him. Now, of course, you say, well, Jesus said he was Jesus, right? But the issue here is how was Paul able to distinguish between some private hallucinatory event or even a demon appearing to him or an angel or something like that he misinterpreted or the actual Jesus? Because he never met Jesus. He didn't know what Jesus looked like or what he sounded like. And this point somehow seems to be completely missed by, well, all the apologists, at least most of them, that Paul has no authority whatever to tell anyone about his own experience of like, oh, this was Jesus and I know it was Jesus, because he didn't know Jesus while he was alive. All we know is that Paul thought he saw Jesus, or at least that Jesus appeared to him in some way. So Paul came to the belief that he had experiences of Jesus, right? We have no way of authenticating that, A, because it was like private. It was just Paul. It wasn't a group experience or anything. But possibly the more important point is that Paul had no way of verifying that because he didn't know Jesus while he was alive. So for all Paul could know, this was a demon who was appearing to him and pretending to be Jesus. Like that is entirely consistent with the evidence that Paul had, right? Because he didn't know what Jesus was like or wouldn't have been able to compare that. I mean, I suppose you could say, well, maybe a demon could have taken on the appearance of Jesus even. But you see what I'm saying? Like, Paul doesn't know Jesus. He didn't see Jesus appear to him afterwards, after the resurrection in the same way that his disciples allegedly did. It's a completely different phenomenon. Even, and this is key, even under Christian theology, it's a different phenomenon because the Pentecost has already happened. This is Jesus coming down and appearing to Paul as a special one-off for some reason after the initial resurrection appearances have already happened. So this is one point, that the appearance to Paul is not explained by the resurrection. I'm yet to hear anyone even attempt to explain to me how it follows from Jesus was raised from the dead, therefore he appears to Paul. There's no connection between those at all. It's an extra postulate that Jesus appeared to Paul, and it's unmotivated. So from my point of view, it's a post hoc rationalization to fit in the fact that Paul became influential in the Christian movement. There's no actual explanation as to why Jesus appeared to Paul, because it's not someone he knew, and it was after Pentecost. It was years after the other appearances. So why did it happen? It seems inexplicable. It doesn't seem to be accounted for under Christian theology or like any actual teachings. It just seems to be a thing that happened because, I don't know, God wanted to do it that way. Stop asking questions. So it's not explained by the resurrection. It's not a fact that's accounted for by the resurrection. It's something you have to postulate in addition. And as I said, it's not really very trustworthy because, I mean, there's no extra verification for it. It wasn't a group appearance. We don't know what Paul saw. We don't really have good details for that. And we don't know how he even knew it was Jesus, how he could be sure that it was Jesus and he wasn't making some mistake or it wasn't someone pretending to be or like whatever was happening or might have been happening. We don't know that because Paul didn't know Jesus. So it's not really very convincing from that point of view. And the other thing is, of course, that there are many examples of people having experiences that lead them to go from one religious tradition to another religious tradition, like Joseph Smith and Muhammad being two obvious examples. But there are many others, lesser known ones as well. I document some of them in my book, but you can also look up like new religious traditions and founders of religions on Wikipedia, and you can see long lists of people who've had different types of experiences that lead them to adopt new religious beliefs. And that's basically what seems to have happened to Paul. It doesn't require a miraculous explanation unless you think all of these others also had miraculous explanations, which I don't think Jeremiah would accept. So the whole appear to Paul thing is just a really weak argument. It's not actually something that's in any way connected to the resurrection because it's not a resurrection appearance. It's a subsequent like vision of someone who didn't even know Jesus. There's no real trustworthiness to the account because it's private and it's not from someone who knew Jesus, so can verify that it actually was Jesus or that it's like someone that he was familiar with. And it doesn't even require any type of supernatural explanation because it's a conversion experience, which is unusual in some sense, but also it's certainly not unparalleled, and there are other cases throughout history, many other cases of these sorts of religious conversion experiences, particularly associated with like founders of religions. And I think basically Paul was a key founder of Christianity as a distinct movement, bringing it away from like a sect of Judaism. So anyway, there's a number of issues there, but Jeremiah just doesn't really address any of these and just sort of asserts Paul's appearance as if somehow it is just evidence that the resurrection occurred, even though and this is, I think, the most important thing, Jesus's appearance to Paul is in no way conditional on him being resurrected. Think about it. Could Jesus have appeared to Paul in exactly the same way if Jesus wasn't resurrected? If he just died and this was him appearing as like a spirit or something, having gone to heaven? That's entirely consistent with what we know. Certainly, Paul doesn't say that he touched Jesus's body or anything like that. So, what exactly is this? Does this have to do with the resurrection? There's just no through line between the resurrection and the appearance to Paul. The appearance to Paul is not explained by the resurrection. It's not connected with it theologically. It's not implied by it or entailed by it. It's not even the same type of phenomena. So I just don't understand how it's supposed to be evidence for the resurrection. It seems like that we could have the appearance to Paul whether or not Jesus was resurrected, and therefore it's just not evidence for anything about the resurrection.
Brother was the Son of God, and everybody laughs because it would just be impossible to think, a sibling could be the Messiah. And yet, what do we know from Josephus? AD 62, it's one of the reasons I date the book of Acts before AD 62. We see that Josephus tells us that James dies. And by the way, Josephus is not in the Bible, friends. He gives us something 28 times longer than any gospel, his writings. He says that in AD 62, that James dies believing his brother is Messiah. That's Josephus telling us that. So I find that thread compelling. I certainly wouldn't leave it out because it's not just the friendlies, the hostiles were coming to Christ as well. They didn't want to.
So again, my class.
So Josephus tells us that James, the brother of Jesus, died as a believer. I think Jeremiah kind of didn't mention this, but it says somewhere, I don't know, I forget exactly where, but it says somewhere in the New Testament that at some earlier point, James was not a believer. And I've made this point in my book that apologists somehow, they're the two dots, right? At one point in time, James was not a believer. At a later point in time, he was a believer. James is also mentioned as being someone who had an appearance of the risen Jesus. So I guess there's three dots here. There's not a believer, there's having an appearance, and then like being a believer. So the assumption, of course, like the only possibility here is that James was converted because of having an appearance. Like he was not a believer up until the point of the appearance, and then afterwards he was a believer. This is what the apologists say. And then therefore, that's how they get a hostile witness out of this. When we have no evidence for any of that, this is all complete speculation. For all we know, James was, and this is what I think happened, if indeed these other points are accurate, James was converted for entirely other reasons. And then subsequent to his conversion, he experienced an appearance of Jesus to him. Now, I mean, that's not the only possibility, but I think that's more likely, right? But the point is that you can't claim that James was a hostile witness because you have no basis for asserting that at the time of the appearance, he was a non-believer and then became a believer because of the appearance. That is entirely speculation, and there's no evidence for that whatever. It's possible, but it doesn't say that anywhere. That's just the apologists putting things together that aren't actually in the text. And so it feels really desperate when they try to squeeze out hostile witnesses when in fact there are no hostile witnesses. There are no confirmed hostile witnesses of like resurrection appearances. If by that we mean like pre-Pentecost appearances of like Jesus's body from people who would have been in a position to know him, like and know who it was. Paul wasn't in that position. It wasn't a resurrection appearance. And James, well, we don't know that he was hostile. So there actually aren't any hostile witnesses that we know of. And just think how easy it could have been for there to have been hostile witnesses, because Jesus could have appeared to literally anyone and any group of people anywhere on the planet, because he's God after all. It's not like he's limited by time and space. But somehow he only appears to his followers, like disciples and some women, and like maybe 500 ? Of course, there's no details about that. So your mileage may vary on the 500. But like, really, God, that's the best you can do? Like, this is the evidence that you wanted us to have thousands of years later about the most important event that ever happened in all of history? Like, not even one other appearance to like, a Chinese scholar or something like that who could write down, no, okay, like, thanks God.
On the resurrection of grad students, at the end, we read books in depth. We look at N.T. Wright and Lacona, and we watch a lot of arguments for and against at times. I'll ask them, I said, what do you find you had to sum up the most compelling evidence for the resurrection? Some will cite the willingness of the apostles to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus rose from the grave. Many will cite the conversion of Paul. And what's interesting about that is a lot of the explanations to account for the disciples, if you say hallucinations, don't automatically apply to Paul. He's not a part of that group. He's an outsider. And it's fascinating. You mentioned Habermas earlier. The vast majority of scholars from the left to the right concede that at least Paul had an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus.
Yes, of course, everyone acknowledges that. I mean, that's why I guess there is, I've forgotten his name, Dr. Price, who rejects all of the Pauline epistles. But I mean, yeah, pretty much everyone agrees that Paul had some sort of experience. I don't understand how the double standards work here. Yes, it's true that whatever I appeal to in order to explain the disciples' appearance experiences, I'm going to have to appeal to something somewhat different to explain Paul's, because he didn't know them, it was in a different context, it happened at a different time, and so forth. Obviously, that's true, right? Yes, we have to appeal to some different phenomena here, or at least somewhat different. There's going to be some differences. Somehow, it's not recognized that that's true for the Christian as well, because Paul didn't know Jesus. It's not like Jesus is appearing to the people who knew him after he died. It's not like he's appearing to them, before Pentecost in the kind of post-resurrection appearances way. The appearance to Paul seems quite different. It's to someone who didn't know him. It's years later, and it has no connection to really anything about the resurrection. Like, that appearance could still have happened regardless of whether Jesus was resurrected or not. So the point is, the Christian has to appeal theologically to some different criteria or explanation about why that appearance happened. It doesn't just follow from the resurrection. Because, I mean, you think about how pathetic the resurrection is as an explanation. Imagine that there were other appearances. Imagine that we did have appearances to other Jews at the time, or whether they're hostile or whether they were converted or not, or there were appearances in India or in China or wherever else. Of course, the apologists would appeal to those, right? They would say, oh, look, more evidence for the resurrection. But this is the problem. There's no criteria about what would be expected following a resurrection. And I argued this in my book, that the resurrection hypothesis is fundamentally flawed because it's underspecified about what is expected on the basis of it. If any and all things that can vaguely be understood as an appearance of Jesus can be explained by the resurrection hypothesis, then your hypothesis is useless, because it doesn't actually make constraints on what's reasonably expected. And therefore, we can't appeal to, say, the appearances to Paul as evidence for the resurrection, because we don't actually know what would be expected under a resurrection. And so this is my problem, that somehow apologists don't, and have never acknowledged this point from what I've been able to see, that the Pauline appearances are not resurrection appearances. They're not expected from a resurrection hypothesis. They're not accounted for by a resurrection hypothesis. They don't even require a resurrection in order to happen, because Jesus could just as well have appealed to Paul regardless of whether he was resurrected in this way. So what exact relevance do they have to establishing the plausibility of the resurrection? Yes, I as a skeptic will have to appeal to a different explanation in order to account for Paul's conversion. I think that we can do that. But the Christian likewise has to appeal to some different principle or divine motivation or theological point or whatever to account for why there was a Pauline appearance in this way, why Paul was the special exception who got a special one-off encore performance appearance after apparently the appearances stopped, and early appearances being to only people who actually knew Jesus, right? Like, I don't know how you can hold these two beliefs in your mind that, oh, well, the skeptics have to provide an explanation because this one's different, but at the same time, this one's just the same as the others and fits into the same category. I don't know how that works, but apparently it does. I don't know.
And then he writes, what is it, a quarter of the New Testament, 13 letters, even critical scholars accept 7 of them, and he's willing to suffer. There was some life transformation that took place. So I appreciate that you lay that out and include it. Now,
yeah, so the founders of essentially any new religious movement were willing to suffer for their beliefs. So I don't know why. Like, is it expected that the early followers of Jesus would be willing to suffer for their beliefs if they firmly but mistakenly held them on the basis of like psychological and sociological factors? Well, yes, of course. Interestingly, I've also argued this. Suppose they made them up maliciously, would they be willing to suffer for them? Well, probably, because liars also have to suffer for their lies. Otherwise, what are they going to do? Just say, you know what? It was all a lie. Like, is that going to go better for them? Usually, if you tell a lie and try to convince people like that, then you have to dig in and you have to try to, you have to suffer a lot in order to try to protect the lie. Like, we see this for con artists. Take Elizabeth Holmes or Bernie Madoff, for example. Both of them suffered immensely, both like while they were trying to perpetuate their lie, and also afterwards, like in trying to protect themselves and cover their reputation. And it's interesting also that even when people are exposed and the evidence is clear that they were liars and frauds, they often don't admit it, even though admitting it would actually often improve their circumstances, like get less sentence by pleading guilty and things like that. Often that doesn't happen. So that in itself is sort of interesting, sort of psychologically, and I think tells us a bit about self-deception and other things. So the point is there an attempt to establish what liars would actually do? Would they be willing to suffer? Or what about people who were legitimately mistaken? Would they be willing to suffer? How does that compare with the willingness to suffer of people who are correct in their beliefs? Can we establish that there's a difference in willingness to suffer in these different categories? There's no effort to do that, of course. It's just all ad hoc speculation about willingness to suffer because it kind of sounds good, right? But there's no actual evidence that's being appealed to here.
Last one, and then we will go to questions. So for those of you with questions, type question in bold and just keep your question as succinct and to the point as possible. We'll go to that. Your last one I find interesting. You said Jesus' resurrection is the only basis for making sense of suffering. So this is not a historical argument. This is more of a philosophical, existential argument. Why do you think his resurrection is the only basis for really making sense of suffering?
We said earlier that if Christianity is a resurrection-less Christianity, whereas I point out in the intro section of my book, if the resurrection is just as William Telford, who examined me, a Markan scholar who was a disciple of William Barclay, he was my examiner in Oxford. If the resurrection is, to use,
remember, he went to Oxford, guys,
his words, imaginative storytelling, then we have no faith at all, Sean. I don't know how you can be a Christian and not believe in the physical bodily resurrection of Christianity, of Christ, because we don't see that kind of faith reflected in the New Testament documents. Tom Wright has done a magisterial job in hundreds of pages of pointing out that everywhere we see Jesus' resurrection, it's a physical bodily resurrection. I mean, he hammered that case home with a slam dunk. And what I've noticed, Sean, in my travels ministering to individuals, real people, I didn't read this in a book. Think of my good friends, Dan and Lynn Wagner in Santa Cruz, California, who lost both of their daughters in a car accident. And he said, Jeremiah, the only reason I'm able to go on losing all of my children in the same moment is I know I will see them again. The promise of the resurrection is the only thing that keeps me going. I'm not living for the 80 or so years on this planet. I'm living for the resurrection. And I wrote this book with my little sister in mind, Jenny Lee. They lost their son, stillborn. We use his name. We say his name in the present, Wesley. Wesley is with Jesus. The first time that he opened his eyes ever in his life, he saw Jesus face to face. And so the resurrection is the only reason my little sister has been going in a beautiful silver lining. She's now pregnant again, and they're having a son. Praise be to God. But I've seen in the real world, when words fail, Sean, when people are suffering and struggling, it's amazing how the promise, the hope of the resurrection that ignited the early Christian movement continues to ignite us with hope. When to face suffering will never be the same. We grieve, and perhaps my favorite verse, my favorite chapter in the New Testament, we grieve, but we don't grieve without hope. Why? Because of the fact of Jesus' physical bodily resurrection.
You know, if somebody were to say, I just don't think you're trying to make sense of suffering. This is a senseless, meaningless.
So Sean gives an objection here, but so this reminds me of Craig's like final argument in his traditional five, that the final argument being like, well, you can know like personally yourself by a subjective, by a personal experience, I should say, of Jesus, that you know Christianity is true, and this reminds me of that, but it's like it's somehow worse. I'm not sure how, but this is literally wishful thinking. It's like saying Jeremiah just said the belief in the resurrection is what keeps me going in life. That's why I get up every day and do what I do, right? That keeps me through difficult times and so forth. And also he appeals to some other people for whom this is true. Yeah, okay, so that's actually evidence against the truth of the belief. Like if people have a very powerful personal motivation, like psychological existential motivation for believing something, that's evidence against that belief being true, at least other things being equal, right? It doesn't mean that it's false, but it shows that there's very powerful reason for those people to have motivated reasons for believing that it's true, even when the evidence doesn't actually support it. And by the way, this also goes to an argument that Jeremiah made earlier about, well, he just can't think of any psychological reasons that the disciples might have had to have made up the belief in the resurrection. Well, maybe, Jeremiah, they think the way that you do. Maybe they couldn't imagine going ahead in life, going forward in life without a hope in Jesus being able to get them through it. And therefore, they developed this idea about the resurrection in order to save their belief and allow them to keep going through life. It's like, how do you hold these two beliefs in mind? On the one hand, that you personally couldn't get through life without belief in the resurrection of Jesus, and that's what motivates you. But then on the other hand, psychological factors like that could never have influenced the early Christians in their beliefs, and they only would have like rigidly followed the evidence and wouldn't have been influenced by any of these sorts of factors. Like, how do you think those two things at the same time and not see that those are in tension with each other? If factors like this wishful thinking and hope and fulfillment influence you, why would they not also have influenced the early disciples? And furthermore, if they influence either of you or both of you, surely that's evidence against the truth of these beliefs, at least somewhat evidence, right? Because it seems to indicate that people, whether it's the initial disciples or whether it's Jeremiah or other Christians and apologists today, they are clearly not. They're clearly very biased and motivated in their reasoning about the conclusions that they come to, because they couldn't even, it's not just that they have a preference for it being true or that they would like it to be true. They couldn't even face life, apparently, if they didn't already have this belief. And so, of course, they're going to find any evidence that they could in order to substantiate it. And somehow this is an argument for it being true. I mean, imagine if an atheist just came out and said, yeah, I hate Christian teaching, and I couldn't face life if Christianity was true, and I just want to do whatever I want and not be constrained by God and his teachings, and therefore that's an argument against Christianity because I just really hate it and don't want it to be true and couldn't face life if it was true. Like, would Christians accept that as an argument against Christianity? But that's precisely the same point made in reverse. It's just absurd, sort of special pleading in the sense of trying to justify why wishful thinking is actually acceptable somehow. I just don't understand how anyone can say that this is actually an argument. All right. Anyway, yeah, I mean, a motivating falsehood is still a falsehood, right? I mean, and anyway, the point is not to say that it has to be a falsehood. It's just that the fact that something is something you really want to believe should make you more skeptical about the evidence that you think is in favor of that. Because you should doubt whether you are actually evaluating the evidence in a fair way if you know that you have a really, really strong desire to believe this. And in fact, you couldn't even get through life. You couldn't even get through the day without believing this thing. But also the evidence is like really strong in favor of it. And of course, I've been objective and fair-minded in reviewing that evidence. Of course, nothing to do with my motivated reasoning, right? It's just, I just don't get how you can not see the tension there. Okay, so I think I will leave it there. As usual, these streams go longer than I wanted to, but I think that's got through the 7 arguments. Let's just do a brief review. So this fantastic new evidence for the resurrection of Jesus consisted in basically appeals to the Bible. It says it in the Bible. And I think there were essentially 3 things. Jeremiah really wants it to be true. It says so in the Bible, and he just can't think of any explanation as to how the disciples would have come to believe in the resurrection if it weren't for Jesus actually appearing to them. Some of those were divided up across multiple different points, but I think that and don't forget the first argument is that Christianity and early Christians changed the world and changed society and changed their lives. That was another point as well. So these are all, first of all, none of these are new. These are all arguments that have been around for decades, maybe centuries, I don't even know, but certainly for decades. So calling it new evidence is optimistic, I think, at best. The second point is that Jeremiah's case was incredibly poorly constructed and developed in the sense of it's not just that I disagree with like the conclusion or I disagree with like particular premises. It's that most of the arguments didn't even have a clear through line. Like maybe 1 or 2 of them kind of did and have to go through, but most of them, as I said, as I sort of articulated going through the video, it's just not even clear how the evidence that he was presenting even got him to the conclusion, even if you accept every claim that he made. Like Christianity has been influential in people's lives and historically, but does that make it true? Like he didn't explain what the connection there was. He can't see of any psychological explanation or motives as to why the early Christians, like the disciples, would have just made up the resurrection. Therefore, the resurrection must have occurred. Well, what's the connection there? Like, do we think that they would have to have invented it? Has he even tried to think about what other factors there might have been? Like, what's the connection between him not seeing it and there not being any? Like, he didn't explain that. He didn't give us a reason to think that there wasn't any. He just said that he can't see it. It says so in the Bible. Well, do we trust what it says? Like Jeremiah claimed to be treating the canonical Gospels just on the same footing as other texts, except he treated them completely uncritically and didn't discuss their the sources or the biases or purposes of their authors or their dating or anything like that you would do if you were treating them like a historical text in an appropriate skeptical kind of scholarly way. So either he treats all historical texts in such a cavalier fashion, or maybe he's not actually treating them on a level footing. And so, yeah, we're not given any connection between just because it says so in the canonical Gospels, therefore it must have happened. Like, what's the connection there? Oh, yeah, the archaeological evidence. We're not given any explanations to why, because it says, because the Gospels got the burial details right, therefore the resurrection must have occurred as described. We're not explained how there's any connection between those at all. We're not explained how there's any connection between the resurrection and appearances to Paul, which, remember, Paul didn't know Jesus. He never met Jesus. The appearance was well afterwards. It is not in any way dependent on the resurrection, so it's not clear how it's connected to it or explained by it. So almost all of the arguments given are not new, and they're not actually arguments that in that the premises or the evidence presented they're not even connected to the conclusion other than in the vaguest way. So this is why I found this video so frustrating, because it's not just like, okay, well, like even like William Lane Craig at least presents arguments, I think, in a more kind of clear and logical way. And it's not just because he like lists the premises. It's just because at least I think generally he tries to be a bit more rigorous than some other apologists are with the way they construct arguments. Even though, of course, have my many issues with Craig, but this presentation was especially bad just because it was so sloppy. And I think it also took Jeremiah a lot of words to say very little. But anyway, I suppose one could sometimes accuse me of the same sin there because I've been going for nearly 3 hours. But I hope that I presented some interesting commentary and pushback against these arguments. So yeah, needless to say, I'm not very convinced by any of these evidences of the resurrection of Jesus. And indeed, if you actually take seriously the idea that the resurrection of Jesus is the single most important event in all of human history, which is the mechanism by which God reconciles humankind to the omnipotent and omnibenevolent presence and sort of nature of God, and establishes, at least potentially, if you accept Jesus, establishes a connection between us and God and allows us to return to a relationship with him. And therefore is the most important event ever and is something that God wants to communicate with all mankind. This is the best that God can do, given that if you believe that story, you think that this is the best that he could do in terms of making that event known to people and providing compelling evidence for it. I just think that's laughable. That's so hard for me to accept. And I've not heard really any convincing reasons to think that is what that this is the state of the evidence that we would expect under that hypothesis. Yeah, the favorite part of the video. Can't forget if I could elbow in a scholarly for a minute. That was so weird. Some interesting sort of table thumping and chest thumping there as well. All right, thanks everyone for joining me in chat. I think there were some good comments there. In terms of upcoming videos, so there are a number of other videos that I would like to cover. From Capturing Christianity in particular. I think some of those I might be doing with Nathan in upcoming months as Bad Apologetics, so keep an eye on those. Oh, thanks, Nidimos. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce your name. Thanks very much for your donation there. He says he doesn't treat the Bible with privilege. Read zero contemporary documents and only documents that postdate the New Testament by 100 years. Good job, great way to start the morning. Yeah, thanks. Skeptics and Scoundrels, another donor. Thanks very much. Yeah, appreciate the support. What was I going to say? Yes, so in terms of future videos, so I may be doing some more responses to some other videos. I think actually Sean has one coming up soon about, I forgot what it was, but it sounded interesting. Was it something about, it's like artificial intelligence and consciousness or something like that, which sounds like it might be up my alley. So I do a review of that one actually. The other thing is that my book, I've done audio book readings and commentary of the first chapter now. That's divided into 3 sections. So next couple of weeks, hopefully I'll do the next chapter, which will be on fine tuning. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully I'll get all of it finished within the next few months, and you'll have that as a resource there. So yeah, that's what's going to be happening in the channel coming up. So thanks very much for listening. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye.